Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we have a glorious story between the most insane, that being the Night Lords and the Dark Elder. Before we get into madness, be sure to like and comment any videos of topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
By the time the sun failed behind the ash banks, the world had already learned the shape of its new obedience. Black weather rolled above Hive Vanikar in slow, choking strata, each layer lit from beneath by the city's own ruin. The upper spires burned like censers the size of mountains. Shrine domes and dynast cathedra split under bombardment and leaned into one another in silhouettes of broken crowns. Fire poured from stained crystal windows in sheets of orange and venom green. The old rulers of the world, those who had resisted compliance, those who had pleaded, those who had tried to bargain once the 8th Legion made planetfall, hung from the lumen towers that ringed the processional causeway. Their arms had been nailed wide upon iron spars. Their chests had been opened. Their skins had been stripped down in long ceremonial ribbons that turned in the hot wind like festival streamers. Flood lamps washed their dead faces in hard white glare so that even from the manufactorum, belts below, the Hive could see what defiance became. Millions looked up at those towers. Millions listened to the broadcasts. The Vox carried the screams again and again, taken from the prisoners before death and looped through the public channels with doctrinal precision. Confession, plea, denial, weeping, the breaking of breath. Every habstack, every sump level, every transit vault and worker barrack heard them until fear ceased to be an emotion and became architecture. This was how the 8th Legion made compliance. Not with speeches, not with banners, with certainty, with spectacle, with the lesson burned into the ganglia until memory itself recoiled from disobedience. Captain Ajalin stood on the balcony of the governor's shattered palace and looked down upon the plaza where the last of the merchant princes were being dragged to judgment. His midnight blue warplate was slick with rain and old blood. Lightning forks crawled across the ceramite of his shoulders in pale silver. The flayed skin of a former enforcer chief hung from his gorget in a drying loop. Around him stood his command cadre in silence, helm lenses cold red in the smog, watching as mortal soldiers pushed prisoners to their knees before the Vox pylons. Beyond the palace district, Hive Vanikar stretched for leagues. Tens of millions were packed inside its walls. Its lower terraces were trenches now, cut through hab-block foundations and transit yards alike. Army auxilia held those lines in layered belts of razor wire, gun pits, and ferrocrete revetments, while the world's remaining militia died against them by the thousand. Beyond the capital, beyond the poison seas and the ore deserts and the rusting maglev roads, the wider subsector still convulsed beneath the blockade. Billions lived under the shadow of the same decree. Billions waited as the warships of the 8th Legion hung in high anchor above their worlds like executioners' blades. The battle barge Nightfall sat above, Vanikar's cloud mass unseen, yet every soul on the planet felt its presence in the way prey senses the hawk before the strike. Vox traffic drowned the air. Panic channels from the underhives, command reports from trench sectors, Munitorum inventory requests, intercepts of rebellion cells begging for extraction, distress bursts from cargo lifters brought down over the northern ashfields. All of it passed through the Legion command net in layered ghosts of static and terror. Ajalin heard it all and gave none of it the dignity of concern. Below, the latest prisoner convoy lurched into the square. The governor's cousins, finance ministers, guild scions, the sons of merchant dynasties who had believed wealth could shield them from the judgment of the emperor's darker sons. They stumbled in chains, their fine coats torn away, their hands stripped bloody against restraint manacles. Ajalin watched their eyes travel upward to the lumen towers. He watched courage die in them before sentence was even spoken. "Commence," he said. The order moved outward on the command net. Enforcer defectors forced the first prisoner to the stone, A legionary in a skull-faced helm drew a flensing blade. Then the night split open. At first it was only a distortion over the plaza, a ripple that made the flood lamps bend wrong, and the rain seemed to fall around an absence in the air. Auspec's screens on the balcony chirped in sudden protest. One of Ajalan's serfs turned toward the signal and had just enough time to gasp before something thin and glittering punched through his throat and burst from the back of his neck in a spray of black arterial mist. The square erupted. Shapes dropped from nowhere. Long, low craft, all blades and hooked prows, skimmed into existence on shrieking grav engines that made the teeth ache. Their hulls were lacquered obsidian and bruised violet, hard to fix in the eye, as though they were reflected in broken water instead of moving through. Real air. Pale figures clung to the rails. They wore segmented armor like lacquered bone and helms shaped into laughing masks. Hook chains lashed down from the skiffs and snared men by the waist, throat, and face. One merchant scion was torn upward so fast his jaw stayed behind, ripped loose against the paving in a burst of blood and teeth. "Contact!" barked one of the serfs. Ajalan was already moving. He vaulted the balcony rail and dropped through the sulfur haze below, with his jump pack screaming. His claws ignited from his gauntlets in curls of blue light. Around him, Night Lords descended like thrown knives, their descent jets hammering the air. Bolter fire cracked across the plaza. Explosive shells tore through one of the Xenos riders and burst him apart in a red-black mist, but the others came on untouched, weaving between impacts with impossible grace. The first skiff scythed past the execution ground. Its prow blades took two auxilia apart from hip to shoulder. Behind it, pale raiders leapt among the kneeling prisoners, not for slaughter, for harvest. That was what made the thing obscene. They did not merely kill the condemned, they selected them. A governor's son, a magistrate, two enforcer chiefs, 3 children of the trade houses who had been brought out to watch their fathers die. Hooked chains bit into flesh and bone, then reeled back with screaming captives kicking in the air. Slim weapons hissed rather than barked. Needle shards punched through flak armor and skin. Men convulsed where they stood, flesh discoloring, veins blackening, eyes running in wet streams down their cheeks. A Night Lord legionary reached one of the raiders and split him from groin to throat with a chain blade. The corpse spilled in halves across the paving. Another Xenos was on the legionary before the body struck ground, a blur of knives and barbed wire, climbing his plate like a hunting insect. The legionary roared, slammed his attacker into a vox pylon, hard enough to crater metal, then fired his bolt pistol point blank into its spine. It came apart in strips. More of the things emerged. The public warning towers became their mockery. One skiff rose between the lumen pylons, and pale hands cut down the flayed corpses the Night Lords had hung there. The skins, prepared with such methodical care by the Legion's artisans of punishment, were dragged laughing into the air. In their place, the raiders left their own work. Within moments, 3 new bodies hung from the tower braces, enforcers taken alive from the cordon, opened from throat to groin with exquisite precision. Organs looped out in decorative braids, faces left untouched, eyes pinned open with silver barbs. Even in the midst of battle, Ajalan felt the insult. This was not simple Xenos violence, it was trespass. He landed amid the kill zone and tore through a pale warrior with both claws, lifting the creature from the ground and opening its torso in a fan of steaming viscera. Another leapt across him, too swift for mortal sight, and drove a blade into the seam beneath his left pauldron. Pain flared cold and sharp. Ajalan caught the attacker by the throat before it could withdraw, and crushed windpipe, spine, and whatever passed for grace in its long-boned body with one closing fist. He hurled the corpse into a skiff's engine vanes. The craft rolled sideways, clipped a tower, and showered the square with metal and burning Xenos meat. "Lock the perimeter," he voxed. "No escape. Bring them down." But the creatures had never intended to stand. As quickly as they had descended, they peeled away. Captives shrieking from chains, corpses and skins dragged as trophies. One by one, the skiffs crossed the upper reaches of the square and struck those impossible seams in the air again. Light folded, rain bent, real space shivered like wounded flesh. Then they were gone. Silence did not follow. Panic did. The square was full of it now. Auxilia, firing at shadows, servitors sparking in circles, wounded prisoners crawling over blood-slick stone, officers shouting for order through vox channels clogged with static and prayer. Above them, the warning towers burned harder, and from one of them, the fresh Xeno's handiwork turned slowly in the firelight like an offering made to mock a god. Ajalan stood amid the dead and listened to the survivors babble. Razor skiffs from empty air, laughing masks, chains with hooks like surgeons' tools, poison blades no armor could stop, pale devils dragging screaming men into cracks in the world. He silenced one witness by crushing the man's face in with the heel of his boot. Another he let live long enough to repeat himself 3 times, because repetition stripped panic down to detail. When the account no longer changed, Ajalan cut the man's throat and looked back up to the ruined palace. He felt the arrival before he saw it. The night deepened. That was the only true way to name it. The darkness beneath the palace colonnades thickened until even the flood lamps seemed afraid to touch it. Legionaries straightened without meaning to. Mortal officers forgot to breathe. The rain no longer hissed on stone. It seemed to wait. Konrad Curze stepped from shadow, as though the dark had finally chosen a shape. He wore no helm. Wet black hair hung in ropes around a face made for death visions and old hunger. His skin was corpse pale beneath the ash. Blood, some of it human, some not, striped his armor and dried black in the grooves of his talons. He moved with a stillness more disturbing than any shout or roar. Not ceremony, not arrival, manifestation. Ajalan dropped to one knee, head bowed. Around the square, every legionary followed suit. "My lord," he said, "Xenos raiders." Curze looked past him, not at first to the dead, but to the stolen towers and the altered bodies. His black eyes moved over every incision, every lifted organ loop, every mocking display. When he spoke, his voice was low and flensed of warmth, yet it carried across the whole blooded plaza. "Do not name them raiders." The words froze the square more completely than any order to stand fast. Curze descended the steps until he stood beside one of the newly hung corpses. He touched the open chest with one claw tip, smearing blood across black adamantium. His nostrils flared once, taking in the chemistry of toxins, the taint of alien oils, the perfume of staged suffering. "Raiders steal from the unwatched," he said. "These vermin came to my lesson. They cut into my punishment. They laid hands upon fear that was already claimed." Ajalan kept his head lowered. "Then give the word, Lord, and we will scour the hive. We will drag every hidden den apart stone by stone." Curze turned his gaze upon him. In that instant, Ajalan felt the full weight of the Primarch's attention, like a grave opening beneath his feet. "They are not beneath the stones," Curze said. "They are behind the wound." No one asked what he meant. That night the palace became a mausoleum of command. Vox adepts whispered. Astropaths bled in their harness thrones. Fleet officers aboard Nightfall relayed targeting solutions to destroyers holding the outer void. Trench lines were reinforced. Curfews redoubled. Public executions resumed, now with wider broadcast. Curze went alone into the upper chamber, where the planetary governor had once hidden his household relics and gene records. They had found the man earlier beneath a collapsed audience hall, dragged him out by the ankles, and prepared him for judgment. Now his half-flayed remains lay across a stone table under shivering lumen globes, still breathing through a ruin of throat cartilage, because Curze had not yet permitted death. The Primarch placed both hands on the table and lowered his head. Sleep did not take him. Vision did. He saw towers impossible in their height, rising in mad profusion beneath a sky that was not a sky. He saw black spires chained together by bridges like knives. He saw suns shackled in cages of occult metal, their captive light spilling crimson through vast arenas slick with old blood. He saw pits full of fighting things, their limbs altered beyond species and mercy. He saw pale crowds baying from tier upon tier of barbed galleries, while below them human multitudes screamed in relay, each wave of agony harvested, measured, traded, consumed. He saw a throne world hidden within a wound between dimensions, a kingdom concealed from sane cartography, where torment was currency and pain moved through the dark like tithe. Konrad. He did not know the full path. His foresight never granted kindness enough for that. It gave destination, fragments, certainties wrapped in torment, enough to walk toward doom with eyes open. No more. When he rose from the vision, blood had run from his nose and one eye. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, and smiled without any trace of mirth. The orders went out before dawn. Seal the subsector. No vessel leaves without Legion sanction. No world is to evacuate. No plea for relief is to be answered. All population centers remain lit. All roads remain open. All garrisons hold in place. Every city becomes bait. Every convoy becomes lure. Every terrified hive, every trench line, every choking manufactorum district becomes a beacon calling to the creatures behind the wound. Some fleet officers hesitated only long enough to damn themselves in silence. Army commanders transmitted protests about casualties, exposure, and strategic risk. Their objections died unheard in the Vox gloom. By first light, the governor finally ceased breathing. Curze stood over the table and looked down at what remained of the world's master. The man's skin had been taken in careful lengths. His ribs were spread. His face had been left almost whole. That recognition might survive suffering. Around them, the chamber windows glowed with the reflected fires of the hive, and beyond those flames, an entire world waited under the knife. Ajalan entered, knelt, and bowed his head. "The cordon is established, my lord. The subsector obeys." Curze did not turn. He looked upon the corpse, upon the blood, upon the lesson interrupted, and upon the greater one to come. "They came to harvest fear," he said. "Now they will learn what fear is." In Konrad, there were palaces made from thefts so old that memory itself had fossilized around them. The spire of Zelianth rose from one such theft, a black lance driven upward through a district of chained bridges and hanging oubliettes, its flanks ribbed with polished bone and mirror-dark crystal that reflected not what stood before it, but what had suffered there. Pale fires burned within cages suspended from its battlements. Beneath those captive flames, the cabal of the shattered halo drank music from the throats of the dying. The audience chamber was a wound made architectural. Its columns had been grown from fused spinal towers, lacquered in amethyst oils. Its floor was a mosaic of silvered vertebrae set into obsidian. Above, the ceiling opened into a false night where predator beasts glided on whispering wings, their shadows passing across the court like thoughts of murder. Along the chamber's flanks hung living curtains of choir stock, human captives flensed to the muscle and wired into resonance frames so that every tremor of pain became a note in the cabal's low, beautiful dirge. Archon Zelianth reclined upon a throne of layered hooks and blackened gold, one long hand resting against his cheek as he watched the chamber's entertainments with the indolent poise of a creature too vain to disguise its danger. His armor was scaled in dark jade and lacquered midnight, barbs and soul traps winking along its seams like predatory eyes. He wore his helm beside him, for the court deserved. His face, it was narrow, aristocratic, almost delicate, until one looked long enough to see what dwelled behind the eyes. Every smile he offered looked like a promise that Pain had not yet learned how to beg properly. At his right stood Urvek thrice opened, the homunculus swathed in layered surgical robes that seemed stitched from old skin. Tubes coiled into the flesh around his jaw. One of his hands ended in a candelabrum of needles. The other was a living assemblage of scalpels and jointed probes that clicked softly against one another in anticipation. His face had been rewritten many times, and not always with concern for symmetry. He smelled of preserving salts, sweet rot, and old laboratory incense. At the foot of the throne stood the Clivex Daev Ka of the Shrine of the Severed Eclipse. He was armored from crown to heel in black plates that drank the chamber's light. The great Clive, resting upright before him, was motionless in his gauntlets, but there was no true stillness in him. He was a contract-given muscle, discipline caged inside ritual murder. He did not belong to Zelianth. He belonged to the terms that bound them both, and he wore that distinction with colder pride than any oath. Around them were arrayed the lieutenants of the Cabal of the Shattered Halo, each one smiling just enough to pass for loyal and not enough to be believed. Vaerosh the Lean stood with one hand on the pommel of a husk blade he fully intended to put in his master's spine once the hour ripened. Serin Valor lounged near the lower steps with false ease, all charm and poison. Mylik Rud sipped narcotic vapors through a silver reed, while calculating how many of the throne guard he could afford to lose in a coup. They flattered as only Comorites could flatter, every compliment a measured incision, every graceful word a knife tested against the whetstone of ambition. A raiding captain knelt before the throne, presenting a chain of trophies, skin strips, signet, seals, a child's small hand still heavy with rings, a flayed face taken intact from one of the public towers of the Mon-Ki world. The flesh was lively, my Archon, the raider said. The fear there was already ripened. One could taste it in the air before the first chain was cast. Zelianth smiled and took up the face by its hairline, studying the work of the Night Lords as one connoisseur might inspect a rival artisan's blade. Crude in places, he murmured, but not wholly without intelligence. Urvek's needle hand flexed. The Mon-Ki artisans improve. Prolonged exposure to terror can refine even cattle. Perhaps we should keep a breeding line from that world. Select for strong lungs, durable nerve clusters, a talent for pleading. They are meat, said Vaerosh, bowing his head just far enough to be proper. At best, choir stock. At worst, ballast. Everything is coin eventually, said Serin, smiling without warmth. Even meat, especially meat. Daev Ka said nothing. Incubi did not waste words decorating appetites. Zelianth rose from the throne and descended the steps with liquid grace. He passed among his lieutenants as though selecting cuts in a butcher's gallery. His fingers brushed trophies, weapons, cheeks, the edge of Urvek's dripping instruments. When he spoke, the chamber leaned into his voice. Pain is squandered by lesser species because they mistake it for rage, he said. Rage is what animals do when the blade finds them. Pain, properly cultivated, is finer. It nourishes, it elevates, it measures distinction, it proves rank. A starving thing howls. A superior being listens, learns, and feeds. He stopped before the flayed human face and held it up toward the pale fires. This world is of interest to me, not because its chattels scream more sweetly than others. They do not. Their voices crack the same. Their marrow boils the same. No, it is the hand already upon their throats. That interests me. Urvek's ruined smile widened. The Night Haunter. At that name, even the chamber's amusement thinned. Zelianth let the silence ripen. Every species has its specialists in fear, he said at last. A warlord, a beast, a priest-king, some shape into which dread condenses. The Mon-Ki king called Curze is rarer. He weaponizes terror with almost Eldari precision. Not for pleasure, not purely. He fashions it into rule, into lesson, into law. There is artistry in that, though one hesitates to praise a creature so base. Mylik bowed. Then why provoke him, my Archon? There are softer herds to pluck. Because humbling him will be seen, Zelianth replied. Because the Dark City fattens itself on spectacle, and there is no spectacle like the theft of another predator's prey. To strike his worlds is not raiding. It is conversation. It is duel. It is reputation written across another being's pride. Seren's grin sharpened. And if the Mon K Primarch answers? Zelianth turned his head a fraction. Then he comes where I wish him to come. Behind his brooding, there is certainty. Behind certainty, pattern. I need only cut the vein he cannot help but follow. Urvek clicked in approval. And when he reaches for it, we draw him deeper, peel the lesson from him, and set it singing in the arenas. Diavkar's helm tilted slightly. He is not cattle. No, said Zelianth. That is why this will matter. The court laughed then, though not with mirth. In Comora, amusement and cruelty had long ago become the same expression wearing different masks. The return flotilla slid through the black between hidden ways and real space with the ease of old habit. Sleek raiders and venom craft moved in a silent crescent around the flagship, their hulls veiled in shadow fields, their prows wet with fresh blood from the world behind them. They emerged near a dead moon that hung over an unlit belt of shattered stone, its surface cratered and ancient, its voidwood face scarred by mining works abandoned centuries before the Imperium had noticed the system existed. To mortal eyes, the place would have seemed empty. To the Drukhari, it felt almost disappointingly plain, a graveyard of rock and cold light, useful only because it was beneath notice. Zelianth stood upon his command dais and watched the moon's broken horizon drift past the crystal hull. Captives hung beneath the lower rails in hooked lines, still alive where possible, sedated where necessary, each body tagged by value. Nobles from Vanikar, enforcers, children of merchant houses, one flayed corpse taken from a Night Lord's warning tower, simply because the insult pleased him. A helmsman turned his masked face. The passage seals behind us, my Archon. No pursuit. No visible pursuit, corrected Zelianth. Mon Ki can be taught. Urvek moved among the captives with proprietary delight, checking pulse rhythms and endocrine output with tiny stinging tools. This batch is rich, fear already matured by prior handling. One might almost believe the Night Haunter works in partnership with us. Zelianth smiled faintly. He does, in the way a torch assists the one who comes later to harvest ashes. The first warning came not from an alarm rune, but from Diavkar. The Clivex turned his helm toward the dead moon and drew his clave in one smooth motion. A heartbeat later, the void detonated. Attack craft erupted from the moon's shadow in murderous silence. Black-hulled Thunderhawks and fast assault boats came on with engines throttled to knife-stroke range. Lance glare stabbed from hidden batteries embedded in the dead rock, splashing dark fire across the leading skiffs. One raider vanished in a bloom of imploding energy and streaming bodies. Then the larger impact struck. Boarding torpedoes hammered into the flotilla. The flagship lurched hard enough to throw two helmsmen from their stations. Crystal panels burst inward. A section of the upper deck folded in upon itself with a sound like some great beast biting through bone. Atmosphere screamed into the void through the ragged breaches. Captives ripped from their hooks and vanished in tumbling silhouettes, still screaming until vacuum took even that. Mon Ki filth, hissed Verosh, drawing his pistol. Zelianth was already moving. Seal the wounded sections, kill the boarders, recover what can still scream. The corridors of the flagship became madness in an instant. The vessel's interiors, built for speed and terror rather than defensive siege, twisted in narrow angles of mirrored black and silver ribs. Emergency gloom flooded the galleries. Splinter fire flashed in hard blue lances. Needler rounds hissed. barbed doors irised shut, trapping warriors with boarders in airless compartments. Cabalites met the first Night Lords at the breech locks in storms of poisoned shards and bladework so fast it seemed one blur of flensed limbs and erupting armor. The Astartes came on without pause. Midnight plate, lightning motifs, skull helms, bolt shells detonating through sleek Xenos bodies in sprays of meat and glittering armor scales. Chain blades screaming against dark alloy. The fighting collapsed distance until every step was blood, every handhold a dying man. A Cabalite gun line formed in the transverse gallery and opened fire on a breach squad advancing through venting vapor. The first legionary took a dozen splinters in the chest and kept coming until a crack grenade blew apart the railing beside the Xenos line and hurled them into one another. Daev Kar hit the boarders then, dropping from an upper gantry with his clave in both hands. He split one Night Lord from helm to pelvis in a burst of ceramite shards and organ pulp, then pivoted into another with the discipline of shrine murder made flesh. And then the lights seemed to fail, though power still flowed. Something moved at the far end of the corridor, a darker stroke within darkness, too swift for sight to measure cleanly. Splinter fire lashed toward it. The muzzle glitters had not finished flashing before it was among them. Konrad Curze crossed the corridor in less time than fear needs to become thought. He came through the Cabalite line like a nightmare finally given permission to touch. One claw took an incubus beneath the ribs and tore upward through cuirass, spine, and helm, ripping the warrior open in a fountain of hot alien gore. Another Cabalite turned, too slow by the width of a heartbeat, and Curze seized him by the face, drove him headfirst into the bulkhead, and smashed skull, helm, and wall into one wet ruin. Splinters struck the Primarch's armor and burst in harmless sprays. He did not even seem to notice. The corridor became a slaughterhouse built around his movement. A Sybarite fired point blank into Curze's throat. The Primarch caught his wrist, twisted until bone punched through skin, then tore the entire arm away and used it to beat the owner to the deck. One of Daev Kar's shrine brothers leapt from a side hatch with his clave raised. Curze met him in mid-strike, caught the weapon under one claw, wrenched it aside, and disemboweled the incubus so violently that half his organs slapped steaming against the ceiling arch. Night Lords surged in his wake, but for several breaths the passage belonged only to the Primarch. Zelianth saw him across the ruin of the gallery and knew at once that pride had not exaggerated the Monkey. Curze was not merely large, he was wrong, built like murder in the shape of nobility. His face was gaunt with old prophecy and older starvation. His eyes shone with the hateful clarity of something that had spent its life studying fear until it ceased to distinguish between weapon and truth. "Fall back," Zelianth snapped. "Through the lower spine. Leave the pilots. Seal the after chambers." The order saved him, though it cost him nearly everything else. By the time the Archon's surviving escort cut free and fled toward the emergency webway shunt, Curze had gutted the flagship's midsection and filled it with the dead. The pilot dais burned. Soul trap veins shattered under bolter impacts. A helmsman tried to trigger scuttle wards and lost both hands to a Night Lord's chain axe before he could complete the sequence. One pilot remained alive when Curze reached the control cradle. The Drukhari was pinned against his own station by broken restraint spars, and a shard of alloy punched through the pelvis. Blood, dark and shining, ran down the command throne into the humming conduits beneath. He smiled anyway, because Comorite arrogance was deepest when pain became unavoidable. "You are very far from your kennel, Monkey," he whispered. Curze leaned close enough for the pilot to see his reflection in those abyssal eyes. "Describe the path." The pilot laughed, soft and wet. "Describe it? Shall I sing it? Shall I name each vein in the dark between worlds? You could flay every inch from me and still die outside the gate." Curze's expression did not change. "Yes," he said, "that is the point." What followed was not a rage, it was work. The Night Haunter removed information as a butcher removes hide, in strips, with method, with understanding of where each cut opened the nerve bundles to the next confession. The pilot spat mockery until the first layers came away. Then he tried bargaining, then shrieking, then babbling half-coordinates, gate harmonics, transit signatures, mnemonic cant in the old Xeno's tongue. Curze corrected each lie with another incision. When the pilot finally understood that death was no longer the currency in question, he told the truth in ragged gasps, painting the path through hidden translation scars and real space apertures near the dead moon. By the end, scarcely enough of him remained to qualify as anatomy. Mechanicum adepts in sealed crawler rigs came aboard under Legion guard once the vessel was secured. Red-robed, mechadendrites twitching, incense burners hissing in the blood-fouled air, they moved through the alien wreckage with a mixture of hunger and aversion. They recovered fractured webway charts that bled light from living crystal wafers. They lifted half-living portal matrices that writhed faintly when disconnected from their housings, like organs unwilling to accept death. They sealed severed soul tech inside black reliquary caskets after 3 servitors collapsed merely from touching it. No one among them claimed full understanding. Their Binharic exchanges were sharp with frustration, awe, and doctrinal alarm. Ajalan found Curze standing in the flagship's command vault while the dead moon turned slowly beyond the cracked hull. Around the Primarch lay broken Xenos, shredded armor, and the remnants of a vessel built for terror now reduced to carrion. "The route is incomplete," Ajalan said, "but it is enough to begin pursuit." Curze looked out into the void, where Night Lord's strike craft circled the captured wrecks like carrion crows around a battlefield. His claws dripped black blood onto the deck in slow, steady taps. "This will not be named a crusade," he said. Ajalan bowed his head. "No, my lord. It is not a hunt either." The Primarch turned then, and there was nothing human in the stillness of his face. "It is a correction." The subsector learned that mercy had been withdrawn long before it understood why. Astropathic pleas burned unanswered in the holds of fleet relays. Civil authorities petitioned for evacuation and received silence. Merchant flotillas trying to break the cordon were crippled by warning fire and left tumbling in the void until their own crews clawed each other apart over dwindling air and water. Every world under the shadow of the 8th Legion was ordered to remain where it was, to keep its hab towers lit, its transit arteries open, its labor columns moving, its manufactoria belching fire into the poisoned skies. No city was darkened to hide. No road was closed to spare those who walked it. No hive gate was sealed against the thing that was coming. Curze made fear into infrastructure. False convoy routes were published through channels the enemy had already tasted. Prisoner transports moved in gaudy, obvious columns through ash wastes and irradiated canyon roads, their cargo holds packed not merely with rebels and conquered officials, but with entire guild lineages, work gangs, captured enforcer cohorts, and the sons of merchant dynasties. Public executions were announced before they occurred. Their times, places, and methods were poured deliberately into Vox traffic already known to be compromised. Hive defenses were weakened in certain districts by visible degrees. Turret towers were stripped from walls that had been impregnable the week before. Army auxiliary regiments were ordered to hold salient positions that any sane commander would have abandoned. Every act was calculated, every apparent error a hook sunk into the future. The populations of 7 worlds became unwilling actors in a snare stretched across light years. In Hive Helicon, tens of millions packed themselves into the lower transit warrens as the upper districts were left exposed beneath stormlit skies, because rumor had reached them that the Xenos came first for towers and wealth. In the glass deserts of Orphax, whole crawler cities were directed into narrower migration lanes so that raiders would find them easier to strike. On Calthor's refinery moons, prison barges were kept idling on the launch gantries in plain sight of the upper atmosphere, all their running lights burning in the void like votive offerings. Across the subsector, troop movements numbered in the millions. Tank divisions rolled where they were meant to be seen. Civilians were herded where they were meant to scream. Panic spread faster than any order could constrain it, but Curze had measured even that. He did not require calm. He required pattern. The hololithic war display in the command vault aboard Nightfall showed each world as a wound of red runes and pulsing vectors. Captain Ajalan stood beneath it in armor still stained from the void ambush, while fleet officers, Vox adepts, and Mechanicum functionaries worked in silence around him. Curze stood apart from them all, one clawed hand braced against the edge of the projection dais, his gaunt face lit in the ghostly wash of tactical luminance. He had not slept. Ajalan doubted the Primarch knew how. A senior Legion officer broke the stillness. Captain Malkarian of the 10th Company was older than most who stood in that chamber, his features carved by old scar tissue and older contempt. He had served beside Curze long enough to know the cost of speaking against him, yet he did so anyway because the arithmetic before them offended even a son of Nostramo. "We waste compliance worlds to bait vermin," Malkarian said. "We loosen our grip deliberately. We permit the loss of labor stock, ammunition, armor, flesh, and time. For each convoy taken, more die in panic than in the raid itself. This bleeds the campaign white." No one moved. Mortal crew near the command pit lowered their eyes, knowing too well how quickly speech could become execution in the presence of the Night Haunter. Curze did not look at Malkarian. He watched the runes pulse and fade above the worlds. "Waste is irrelevant." Malkarian's jaw hardened. "With respect, Lord, waste is always relevant, even to us." "Not now." Curze's voice was soft enough that the chamber had to lean into it. "You are thinking as a commander. Count your shells, count your dead, count your fuel and your wounded and the depth of your magazines. All useful things, all lesser things. These creatures are predators. Predators return where the screaming is richest. They circle what feeds them. They test for habit. They trust appetite more than caution. That is their weakness." Malkarian said nothing. Curze finally turned his eyes upon him. "Would you rather I throw the Legion blind into the dark and hope chance serves us? No. We will teach them repetition until they cannot help but answer it. Then we will close the hand." Malkarian bowed once, stiff as a blade being sheathed. "As you command." "As I foresee," Curze said. That last word lingered like a toxin. Even among the Night Lords, who had long since abandoned any hope that their sire was fully tethered to mortal reason, there remained unease whenever he spoke of the future, as though it were a corpse already opened on a table. Cruelty they understood. Predation they revered. But destiny discussed as battlefield mathematics chilled even Astartes' hearts. The raids came harder with each passing cycle. On Helicon, Secundus. The first assault descended during a storm severe enough to strip paint from Hab walls. Thunder rolled over the hive belts, while public channels broadcast the execution of a rebel magistrate and his entire family from the summit of the Administratum spire. Midway through the sentence, the sky tore. Razor skiffs came shrieking through a seam of bent light, dropping pale killers into the execution square and along the Hab terraces below. The Drukhari moved through the crowds like silvered scalpels through flesh. Hook chains took the condemned and the spectators alike. Splinter fire hissed blue through rain and smoke. Night Lords waited until the attack was fully committed, then fell from the thunder with jump packs blazing, turning the central plaza into a charnel funnel of bolt detonations and chain-blade spray. By the time the enemy withdrew, the magistrate's skin had been cut from the tower and replaced by the ribboned remains of an astropath choir. The square was ankle, deep in blood. 2 full companies of auxilia were gone. On Orphax, ash waste columns ground forward under black daylight, Lehman Russ battle tanks and support carriers crawling through a desert on fire from Prometheum denial strikes. Their progress was slow by design. Vox traffic was left loud and undisciplined, so that distress calls and route changes spilled into the dark. The Drukhari came out of mirage and dust on skimmers so fast, the eye barely fixed them. They skimmed over tank lines with their blade vanes taking heads from turret hatches. Dark light lances punched molten holes through armor. Raiders descended on the prisoner columns in their wake and lifted whole chains of captives bodily into the air. Night Lord's terror squads emerged from burial pits in the dunes and opened up at point-blank range, blowing Xeno's riders apart in storms of shell fragments and burning meat. But even then, the enemy escaped with thousands screaming in their hooks. Across the monthsless pace of the campaign, regiment after regiment vanished. The 47th Julthan Auxilia held a refinery canyon on Niox until Vox contact ceased. Recon flyovers found their tank berms intact, their artillery still cooling, their trenches full of lasguns and boots and blood, but no bodies. Only the command staff remained, flayed and hung skinless from the Vox masts, with their tongues pinned against their throats by silver barbs. The 4th Vanikar siege cohort marched 300,000 strong into the trench belts before Hive Joran and was reduced to a litter of empty helmets, gnawed bones and chain marks dragged across the mud. The enemy were growing bolder. Every successful theft emboldened them. Every pattern Curze laid before them was one more taste of certainty. They began striking not only where the bait was richest, but where they believed the Night Lords most invested in ownership. It was insolence refined into strategy. Curze approved of that, though he did not call it approval. In the lower vaults of Nightfall, where no lumen burned without his leave, the visions worsened. He would stand motionless for hours with blood drying beneath his nose and under his fingernails, seeing what no one else could bear to see. Branching futures opened before him in shards and convulsions. In one path, his sons advanced into a maze of black glass and mirrored corridors where the walls themselves birthed knives. They were butchered there by hidden things that drank their dying thoughts like wine. In another, a gate of living bone and nerve was opened from the inside by hands not human, its jaws parting in a manufactorum cathedral, while something older than malice breathed through. In another, he saw himself knee-deep in dark blood, one claw through the shattered spine of an Archon whose eyes still burned with unbelief. And beyond that ruin, beyond triumph, beyond immediate slaughter, a darker throne watched from immeasurable distance, patient and amused. Each future exacted, its price merely for being witnessed. Ajalan found him after one such fit in a chamber whose walls had been gouged by Primarch talons. Blood ran from the Primarch's mouth in thin threads. His eyes were open, but focused on distances beyond the metal before him. "My lord," Ajalan said quietly, "which path remains?" Curze's answer came at once. "The bloodiest viable one." Ajalan felt his secondary heart tighten. "For us. For everyone." Curze turned then, black eyes lucid with suffering too ancient to call madness. "Do not ask me for gentler arithmetic. It does not exist." Word of such utterances spread through the Legion, despite every effort to contain it. Astartes, who had marched through genocide without wavering, felt a colder discomfort take hold. The sire did not merely delight in atrocity. He was selecting the future by casualty gradient. He was choosing slaughter as a navigator chooses a star. Below the command decks, in a chamber ringed with hexagrammic wards, the machinery of pursuit took shape under hands less gifted and far more afraid. The mechanicum savant, called Adept Leor Voss, had once overseen archaeotech extractions on dead moons far beyond the reach of Mars. Now he labored under Night Lord's sanction, with half his original body replaced by grafted augmetics, and every prayer to the Omnissiah sharpened by terror. Beside him was chained the Xenos Navigator, taken months before from one of Zelianth's lesser craft, a pale creature of the dark kin whose elegance had not survived interrogation. His fingers had been removed one by one. One eye had been replaced by a noospheric spike. His nervous system was kept delicately alive by narcotic drips and pain stimulants, because suffering made him honest more often than kindness would have. Together they worked over fractured webway data, soul crystal shards, and a half-living portal matrix that pulsed weakly upon the dissection frame. The matrix looked less like a machine than an organ cut from something impossible and compelled to keep functioning through blasphemous means. It twitched whenever the Xenos breathed too quickly. Voss moved his mechadendrites through a web of runes and resonance gauges. "Not the primary city," he said in a tremor of binharic clicks, translated through his vox grill. "The vectors do not resolve toward a singular nexus. They branch, nested gates, subsidiary dominions, transit realms." The chained navigator laughed through broken teeth. "You stare at veins and think you have found the heart." Voss jabbed a current through the spike in the creature's eye socket. The Xenos convulsed, hissing. "Clarify." The prisoner sucked in a ragged breath. "Not Comora entire, never that. You are cattle peering at a cliff face and thinking it the whole mountain. There are ports, outer dominions, slave markets fattened on the overflow, arena districts, places linked by the arteries of the webway, close enough to feed the dark city, distant enough to be abandoned when convenient." Ajalan, listening from the chamber threshold, stepped inward. A slave port. The navigator's split lips curled. "A paradise of knives, Monkey. A place where your kind arrive in chains and leave in pieces, if they leave at all." Voss adjusted the runes, bringing new lines of geometric impossibility shivering into the hololithic air. The path resolves through repeated assault signatures, the same transit scar, the same harmonic wound. They are returning not from the core, but from a linked satellite dominion. Ajalan turned at once and summoned Curze. The Primarch arrived with no fanfare, his presence filling the chamber with a pressure-like air before a storm break. He listened without interruption while Voss laid out the converging data. He watched the Xenos prisoner as a man might regard a map made from fresh skin. When the explanation was done, silence held for several breaths. "So," Curze said at last, "they feed from a place they consider secure." Voss bowed low enough that his mechadendrites scraped the floor. "By all recoverable data, yes, Lord. A Comorit dominion, a secondary node in the arterial structure." Ajalan spoke carefully. "Then we have what we need to intercept them in real space and continue attrition." Curze's head turned by a degree. "No." The word cracked through the chamber like a blade through thin bone. "We do not merely stop the raids," he said. "We do not content ourselves with killing whatever hands reach through the dark. That teaches nothing. I will strike the place they believe untouchable. I will take their hidden certainty and show them it is only another throat." Even the chained Xenos forgot his pain for a moment and stared. Ajalan bowed. "You mean to carry war into their own shadow?" "I mean to turn their society against itself." Curze stepped toward the hololithic lattice until the impossible geometry painted his armor in sick light. "They are bound by appetite and suspicion. They trust fear because they believe they own it. We will correct that error. We will make their own paranoia the knife that opens them." No one in that chamber mistook the enormity of what he proposed. Not a raid against a passing force, not reprisal in mortal space, an intrusion into the dark between worlds, a strike at a dominion of the very species that had built its civilization upon abduction, torment, and the confidence that no lesser race could ever answer in kind. Curze smiled then, and there was nothing sane in it. Preparations began below Hive Vanikar, in the bowels of a manufacturum district already butchered hollow by compliance. Entire assembly cathedra were emptied of workers and repurposed into ritual geometry. The walls were daubed in oils, blood, and warding compounds. Mechanicum adepts installed the captured matrix into a vault of adamant braces and induction coils, while chained psychers screamed behind plated masks. Legion serfs carried in black iron pylons and racks of power cells. The floor was slick with machine grease, sacrificial blood, and the ash of burned saints taken from the city above. Lumen skulls hung from cranes and gantries in swaying rows, their eye sockets flickering weak gold over the vast chamber. The Night Lords gathered in silence. Company by company they assembled beneath the gantries, midnight armor drinking the broken light, helms held or sealed, weapons maglocked and waiting. Their banners hung still in the stale air. Mortal auxiliaries assigned to hold the outer cordon made the sign of the Aquila when they thought no legionary was looking, then stopped when they remembered what sort of angels stood before them. At the chamber's center, the portal matrix began to wake. Its living surfaces flexed. Light leaked from seams that had not existed a moment before. The air thinned and sharpened, tasting of copper, frost, and old graves. The induction coils shrieked. One of the chained psychers burst apart from within, showering the dais with blood and steaming offal. The wound in reality answered with a line of impossible radiance, thin at first, then widening into something vertical and hungry. It was not light as any human thing understood light. It was too pale and too starved, a blade of illumination with darkness clinging to its edges like scab tissue around a fresh cut. Depth recoiled around it. The chamber seemed suddenly longer, narrower, wrong. A cold wind breathed through from somewhere that was not a place mortals should ever have named. Curze stood before the opening with his claws lowered and his face raised toward that impossible slit between worlds. Behind him, the Legion waited without a word. Before him, the gate widened in the depths of the butchered manufactorum, its light wrong, thin and hungry. The first blows fell in real space. Above High Vanikar, the warships of the 8th Legion shifted in their high anchor and opened fire into the black around the manufactorum breach zone, not to destroy the gate, but to scour every approach that might carry interference to it. Lance batteries burned white scars across the upper atmosphere. Macro shells crossed the cloud banks in shrieking descents and burst among the abandoned districts surrounding the portal complex, flattening hab towers, ferrocrete causeways and transit stacks in rings of fire vast enough to be seen from the palace heights. The bombardment was not aimed at a foe already present. It was the first layer of the operation's cruelty, a sealing strike to ensure that nothing human remained near the gate except what Curze intended to spend. Below, the manufactorum cathedral shook like a thing being flayed open. The wrong light of the portal had widened from a wound to an abyssal seam tall enough to swallow titans, though none would pass through it. Induction pylons screamed under impossible loads. Cogitator banks burst in showers of molten brass and black glass. Chained psychers died by inches to keep the matrix aligned, their skulls haloed by corona arcs as their souls were pulled thin across equations no human mind had been built to host. Mechanicum adepts labored in prayer and panic around the breach supports, while mortal soldiers were driven forward into concentric defensive belts under the guns of Legion overseers. They were not there to survive. Massed human formations, penal cohorts, broken auxilia regiments, press-ganged hive militia, and condemned labor battalions packed the outer galleries in their tens of thousands, lasrifles clenched in shaking hands, flak armor hanging loose over bodies already half-starved by the wider campaign. They had been told they were holding a strategic threshold for the Emperor's justice. Some believed it. Some knew the lie, and stood anyway, because the Night Lords behind them were more immediate than any Xenos. Nightmare ahead. When the portal pulsed, and the first sheets of freezing dark wind poured through, whole ranks began to weep. Commissarial cadres shot enough of them to keep the others in line. Then the order came. The 8th Legion advanced. Thunderhawks and assault boats plunged from the launch decks of Nightfall and her escorts, not into open sky, but toward a wound in reality held open by murder and machinery. Their hulls vanished into the thin, hungry light one after another, swallowed whole. Behind them came drop pods descending on grav clamps through the manufactorum vault, slamming toward the portal mouth to establish the first hard line beyond it. Companies of Night Lords marched beneath hanging rows of flickering lumen skulls and entered the black vein in measured silence, boots grinding over blood-slick metal, bolters mag-locked, chain blades dormant for the moment before revelation. Curze went at the head of them, unhelmed, pale face raised into the wound as though he recognized something intimate in its wrongness. The first mortal formations followed because they were driven forward with shock mauls and bolt rounds. They went in screaming. Passage through the gate was not motion, as any sane species should have known it. One moment there was the scorched air of the manufactorum, the stink of promethium, blood, machine grease and fear. The next, there was cold. Not void cold, not winter. Cold like submerged knives pressed between the ribs and under the tongue. It entered the armor joints. It filled the sinuses. It made every scar remember itself. The geometry beyond refused obedience. Distance no longer held still. A corridor half glimpsed ahead would, upon the next step, become a cavernous artery stretching for leagues, then narrow again into a ribbed passage whose walls seemed near enough to brush both shoulders at once. Causeways curved where no support existed. Bridges crossed above and beneath one another in impossible inversions. The structures did not seem built. They seemed grown or secreted, like calcified channels inside some immense and long-dead organism. Light moved in pale veins beneath the walls. Shadow pooled in angles that had no right to cast it. Sound came wrong. Boots thundered from behind when the tread was ahead. Vox traffic returned with words not yet spoken. More than one legionary heard screams in the distance and could not tell whether they were ancient echoes trapped in the webway's skin or voices from battles still to come. The mortal soldiers fared worse. The first ranks stumbled out of formation as perspective folded around them. Men fired at shapes that turned out to be their own comrades, seen along impossible reflection lines. Entire sections reeled to one side, when a floor that had seemed level became a sloping plane without visibly changing. One platoon of Vanikar trench infantry simply vanished between steps, swallowed by a vertical dark seam that had not been there a heartbeat earlier. The screams rose, twisted, and continued far below, long after no one could still see the falling bodies. The enemy hit before the Night Lords had fully spread. Scourges came down through the pale heights like hooked meteors, winged shapes in lacquered armor, pinions edged with blades and toxin quills. They folded from the upper dark and opened fire as they fell, splinter shots hissing through the cold in dense storms that burst flak armor, found visor slits, and drilled through throats with venomous precision. Human formations in the gate mouth died by companies, collapsing in frothing heaps as poison cooked them from the inside. A second later, the scourges landed among the survivors and turned the breach line into butchery, their shard carbines spitting blue death, while their hooked wings tore faces and hands from anyone who got too close. Mandrakes boiled from shadow at the same instant, not descended, not advanced, manifested. The dark along the passage walls thickened and then released long-limbed things with ember eyes and mouths that opened too wide. They came with silence at first, then with the wet sounds of flesh parting. Auxilia vanished in halves. A sergeant was lifted bodily by a hooked hand through the back and nailed against the ribbed wall before he realized he had been struck. Night Lords met them with chain blades roaring to life, and the first true contest of the Black Vein began in sprays of blood, alien ichor, and flayed skin. Raiders skimmed in from side arteries impossible to have predicted by ordinary logic, their prows nearly scraping the corridor walls as they flew at angles that made the eye revolt. Darklight lances blew apart the lead drop pods where they had landed, turning the first established redoubts into fountains of molten ceramite and exploding gene flesh. Assault boats struck back in enclosed space, strafing down the length of passages that should never have admitted aircraft at all. One Thunderhawk clipped, a jut of black crystal, and sheared open from nose to tail, hurling burning legionaries and crew into both walls at once. A Drukhari skimmer rammed straight through the fire plume and hit the wreck broadside, the two craft tearing apart in a convulsing knot of fuel, limbs and shrapnel that spattered everyone within 30 meters. Company by company, the 8th Legion forced order out of the nightmare. Ajalan's warriors seized the first wide chamber beyond the gate and turned it into a bastion of bodies. Malkarian's company drove left along a bridge made from translucent black material that showed pale movement beneath its surface, as if something lived under the floor and resented every footfall. Heavy weapons teams set up where they could, only to discover that firing lanes lengthened and shortened between breaths. Mortal crews assigned to support them were cut down so quickly that some heavy bolters ran dry before their first ammo feed could be reloaded. The dead piled thick around the breach mouth. Human corpses slid under Astartes' boots until the floor became a red-black paste of organs, loose teeth, toxin foam, and fragments of armor. Curze was already further ahead than any signal should have allowed. He moved through the black vein with a certainty that chilled even his sons. It was not mere speed, though he had that in abundance. It was not only ferocity, though every path he crossed became ruin. It was the impossible intuition of his violence. Twice Ajalan saw the Primarch turn and strike into empty dark, where no foe was visible, only for a mandrake to emerge a fraction of a heartbeat later, already impaled through the skull on one of Curze's talons. At a fork, choked with smoke and screaming, Curze sprang upward to a ledge no one else had marked as tactically relevant, and the moment he landed there, a cluster of scourges dropped from the unseen ceiling directly into his claws. On a swaying causeway, he halted, looked to his right at a blank wall, then drove straight through it, just as hidden raiders phased from behind a shadow field. He ripped the lead pilot from its saddle and hurled the corpse into the second skimmer, hard enough to burst both machines apart. Malkarian saw it too. He fought his way to a point abreast of the Primarch, gore running in sheets from his chain blade, and voxed across the private command channel. "Lord, you are fighting as if you hear the battle before it happens." Curze did not look at him. He opened a cabalite from clavicle to hip and kicked the twitching halves off the causeway. "No," he said. "I hear the dead." The words passed through the channel and left no one eager to speak again. Yet the Drukhari were not routed. Whatever shock Curze's initial thrust caused, it lasted only moments. Their countermeasures evolved almost instantly. Power along the passageways failed in deliberate sectors, plunging whole arteries of the webway into blackness so complete that even Astartes' autosenses struggled against it. Beacons placed by Night Lord scouts were lured into overconfidence, then shot out in cascading sequences that left isolated companies fighting blind, while splinter fire came from 3 dimensions at once. Raiders performed false retreats, peeling back under controlled pressure until the legionaries pursued into wider chambers already seeded for death. The first kill box took the remains of the 9th Claw. They chased a withdrawing line of cabalites across a bridge suspended over what looked like an abyss of faintly lit mist. Halfway across, hidden charges folded the causeway in 3 places. As the Night Lords struggled for footing, pain engines emerged from recesses along the walls and opened fire. Liquefier jets washed the bridge in alchemical flame that ate through ceramite seals and flesh alike. Splinter cannons scythed from above. The survivors tried to leap the broken spans and were caught in the air by hooked chains cast from waiting. skimmers below. They were dragged down alive, vanishing into the mist, with their voices still on the vox. The second kill box nearly took Ajalan himself. A squadron of raiders feigned panic and fled into a gallery lined with black spines. He pursued at the head of his company, only to discover the spines were dormant weapon nests. They unfolded into shrieking pain engines powered by bodies still alive inside them. Men, human men, half flensed, half grafted into metal rib cages and scythe limbs, their lungs pumping through brass bellows, their eyes wired open under crowns of needles. Some had been reduced to torsos, embedded in tracked carriages, bristling with injector spines and rotary blades. Others dragged themselves on too many limbs, stitched from several captives at once, their fused mouths opening in endless surgical howls. Urvek's craft had gone beyond cruelty into blasphemous anatomy. The engines attacked with eagerness born not of machine logic, but of living agony. Redirected into weapon function, bolter fire exploded chunks from them. They kept coming. One slammed into a Night Lord and wrapped barbed limbs around his torso, soaring through armor, while the captive faces fused into its chest, wailed in ecstatic torment. Another vomited a stream of liquefied tissue and acid that stripped an auxiliary fire team to bone in seconds. A tracked construct hit the wall, ricocheted and split open beneath Ajalan's claws, spilling a tangle of linked nervous tissue that still tried to crawl. For the first time since entering the Black Vein, even the sons of Curze recoiled. Curze did not. He reached the chamber at the height of the fighting and took in the engines with one sweep of his black eyes. No disgust touched him, no revulsion, only judgment. He crashed into the nearest construct, hard enough to pulp the captives inside their metal frame, then tore the machine open and used one still living component as a flail against the next. He moved through Urvek's abominations with escalating savagery, ripping out nerve bundles, stamping skulls flat, hurling broken engines into skimmer hulls until the chamber became a furnace of burning chemicals and atomized blood. When the surviving Drukhari tried to withdraw, he forbade it. "Take them alive," Curze voxed. Night Lords obeyed with the bitterness of the wounded. Cabalites were dragged from wrecks, beaten down, disarmed and pinned to the ribbed walls of the passageways, with iron spikes and combat knives driven through wrists, elbows, shoulders and thighs. Some were nailed upright, some spread wide, some with their own weapons through their tongues and jaws. Curze himself fixed the first of them in place at a crossroads of the webway, arranging the body with the fastidious care of a punishment artisan. The captive still breathed when he finished. So did the next, and the next after that. Soon the walls of the Black Vein carried a new language. Drukhari warriors hung alive in butchered tableau all along the arteries the Night Lords had claimed, their opened bodies set as warnings to any eye that understood fear. It was not enough that they die. They were to become signage, lesson, meat script, written in the dialect Curze trusted above all others. The advance resumed through a corridor network, now thick with corpse stink and chemical frost. Behind the Legion, mortal support formations had almost ceased to exist as coherent units. Whole regiments had been erased in minutes. Attack craft dueled and died in passages too narrow for their wings. Wounded Astartes fought on with venom eating through their organs and armor seals spitting warning runes. The dead lay so deep in places that the legionaries climbed over a packed layer of bodies rather than the floor itself, boots sinking into pulped flesh, broken weapons and detached hands. Yet still they advanced, because Curze advanced, and because every path not forward seemed to end in a darker form of death. At last, the geometry widened. The final artery opened not into another kill chamber, but onto immensity. The Night Lords emerged onto a threshold carved into the side of a vast black harbor, suspended within the hidden dark. Before them spread a city, fed by agony. Towers rose like serrated spears, chained together by high bridges and docking spans. Great mooring gantries jutted over a gulf full of moving lights and drifting craft. Black docks hung in tiers one above another, crowded with skimmers, barges, slave lighters, and needle-thin vessels sliding through the gloom. Flayed banners stirred in a wind that smelled of blood, incense, and cold metal. Far above, sky traffic streamed between impossible spires, while below, beyond the harbour's edge, the greater city glimmered in cruel constellations of pale fire and screaming industry. No one spoke. Even the Night Lords, masters of terror in the mortal dark, stood for a heartbeat before the threshold of that nightmare port and understood that they had come to a place where suffering was not a tactic or a punishment. It was the foundation stone of everything. What lay beyond the harbour was not a city in any sane sense. It was an appetite made civic. The dominion spread outward from the black docks in tier upon tier of nightmare industry, each district connected to the next by chains, grav roads, elevated galleries and bridges so narrow they resembled knife blades laid across the abyss. The harbour itself was only the mouth. Beyond it, the slave port opened into a labyrinth of pens, transit barracks, flesh markets, oubliette towers, and arena wards large enough to swallow Hive City's whole. Billions passed through those regions in chains, humans, greenskins, things whose species the Imperium had never named, and stranger breeds still were moved in columns through the gloom beneath the eyes of masked overseers and insect-thin skiffs. Some were auctioned in the open markets beneath needled arches where their teeth, scars, and terror responses were appraised like meat grades. Some vanished into surgical cathedra that rose from whole districts of iron and living bone, where homunculi and their apprentices rewrote anatomy with the deliberation of sculptors. Some were sent upward toward the arena realm, where lightning storms rolled perpetually above amphitheaters, slick with old blood, and ringed by balconies crowded with screaming wealth. Others simply disappeared into chutes, grates, and digestion pits from which only nutrition, narcotics, and weapon stock returned. The Port of Knives had been built from previous victims in ways no human imagination would have anticipated and no human conscience could have borne. Walls showed rib patterns beneath lacquer and stone because they were rib patterns. Stair rails were made from fused spinal chains. In one district, entire facades had been assembled from cured faces, nailed edge to edge, mouths sewn open in decorative shrieks. Another quarter rose, around the shell of some colossal dead beast whose bones had been hollowed into guild halls and execution theatres. Between the higher towers hung chandeliers of preserved organs suspended in crystal cylinders, each one lit from within by captive soul lamps that pulsed as if remembering their owners. Beneath everything ran the manufactoria, chained and smoking, where pain engines were assembled from steel, alchemy, and captives still alive enough to make the work worthwhile. Even the Night Lords paused before it. They stood upon the threshold ways overlooking that harbour, and for the first time in centuries, felt the shape of another species' perfected answer to terror. On Nostramo, fear had been the currency of alleys, gang feuds, and midnight law. In the Great Crusade, it had become doctrine, punishment, and imperial utility. Here it was something wider and fouler, not simply the instrument of rule, not even the theatre of dominance. It was agriculture, economy, recreation, architecture. A civilization whose genius had been spent refining the extraction, display, and consumption of agony until the boundary between governance and sadism had entirely rotted away. A legionary beside Ajalan stared across a district where chained captives marched up a broad incline toward a row of towering surgical cathedra. As each column vanished into the machines, the structures flashed with pale luminescence and exhaled thin streamers of steam that smelled of opened organs and antiseptic rot. "We have walked into the inside of a scream," the warrior voxed. Ajalan did not rebuke him. He felt it too. Curze stood at the foremost edge of the threshold and studied the dominion with the stillness of a carrion god.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
He looked not at the surfaces first, but at the movement beneath them. Traffic patterns, guard concentrations, sky lanes, separation between districts, the direction of panic if the port's heart were squeezed. He watched the higher towers where nobles and sybarites gathered in private galleries above the market wards. He watched the anti-grav lanes feeding the arena districts. He watched the slave columns and the spacing between their chains. He watched the patrol routes of incubi bodyguards and the leisurely confidence of Kabbalite enforcers who had never imagined that a foe would stand here alive. His black eyes narrowed. "They built this too well," Ajalan said quietly. Curze answered without turning. "No, they built it for appetite, not endurance." Ajalan glanced toward him. "My lord?" Curze pointed with one blood-dark claw toward the upper towers. "Look above the pens. Separate districts for separate hungers, separate compounds for separate lords, redundant guards, but not shared command, each enclave watching the next, every bridge narrow, every lane controlled. They do not trust one another enough for depth. Their cruelty is infinite, their solidarity is not." Malkarian came up behind them, helm maglocked, to his thigh, his scarred face unreadable beneath a grime of Xeno's blood. "Then we break them apart." "We let them break themselves apart," Curze said. "Appetite, fear of rank, relief that another throat is under the knife before their own. Those are the nails holding this carcass together. Remove certainty, and it comes apart." He began issuing orders at once, and the next phase of the invasion ceased to resemble a frontal assault in any conventional sense. Kill teams were detached from the main advance and sent not toward the heaviest concentrations of resistance, but into the noble tiers, the arena service districts, and the anti-grav substations that fed the wealth quarters above the port. Tech Marines and Mechanicum slaves were driven toward the power lattices with sabotage charges and harvested portal data. Assault claws took position over the main slave routes, not to secure them, but to rupture them at carefully chosen points. Night Lord's recon squads descended into the underways beneath the amphitheaters carrying blade charges, terror beacons, and cut-down Vox relay units adjusted to broadcast shrieks across local channels. "Do not kill the masses too early," Curze told them. "Open the pens, blind the roads, drive them upward." Ajalan understood before the others did. "Into the wealth tiers." Curze gave the slightest incline of his head. "They have built their safety above the suffering of others. We will reverse the flow." "What of the arenas?" Malkarian asked. "Sabotage their spectacle," Curze said. "Take the lights, take the lifts. Let beasts, slaves, and patrons find each other in the dark." "And the prison vaults?" Curze turned then. "Those I will take myself." The legions scattered into the city's arteries. What followed in the noble towers began as murder and became insinuation. Night Lords' kill teams moved through private galleries and Sybarite estates with the intimate efficiency they had, once brought to Nostraman clan purges. They avoided the loudest corridors and selected victims whose deaths would read as betrayal rather than invasion. An Archonlet, entertaining clients on a suspended pleasure deck, was found hanging from his own Grav chandelier, flayed in long vertical strips, with his skin braided around the throats of his guards. 2 flesh artisans in one of the upper laboratories were nailed spread-eagled across a viewing window in a posture reminiscent of old Nostraman punitive displays, their opened rib cages filled with the signet seals of a rival cabal. A Sybarite tax lord vanished from his banquet hall and reappeared impaled atop a tower bridge with the tongues of his lieutenants stitched into his eyelids. Everywhere the Night Lords took pains to make the slaughter look personal, directed, factional. It worked faster than bolter fire. In the audience sanctum of the Shattered Halo, Vaerosh arrived spattered in fresh blood and fury to find Serin already there, both of them shouting before formal courtesies had been completed. "This reeks of your hand," Verosh snarled. 3 of my collectors opened like fish and left wearing your colors. Seren laughed in his face. If I had struck you, you would not have servants left enough to carry the accusation. Urvek drifted between them, delighted. Please, continue. It would be a pity to let the Monkey monopolize tonight's amusements. These are not Monkey killings, Verosh said. Too precise, too informed. Someone is cutting within the cordon. Someone, Seren replied. Or several someones who smell opportunity. Do not confuse panic for evidence, Verosh. Daev Kar stood near the chamber doors, helm tilted, as distant alarms changed cadence. He spoke only when silence had thickened enough to cut. Contracts are already dissolving in the lower harbour. Mercenary packs have changed banners twice in one watch. The anti-grav lanes are failing in the west tiers. Your rivals will not wait for certainty. Verosh rounded on Zelianth. Then name the traitors and unleash us. Zelianth did not answer immediately. His gaze rested on the flickering tactical displays as more runes went dark. Power failures rippled through the arena wards. Market vox channels filled with overlapping screams. Reports arrived of pens opening in sequence through the Wealthwood approaches, not by rebellion, but by deliberate release. Seal the tower bridges, he said at last. Recall all outlying escort bands. Anyone who cannot prove his value within the next quarter cycle dies. Seren smiled thinly. At last. Honesty. Honesty came quickly after that. In 2 adjacent towers, incubi bodyguards killed their own patrons when payment signals failed, and the patrons suddenly looked more profitable as corpses than liabilities. Contracts snapped across the district like wires under strain. One mercenary contingent turned its splinter cannonry on a noble estate rather than reinforce it. Another simply withdrew to protect its own docks. The Dominion had not yet understood the full shape of the invasion, but suspicion outran knowledge, as it always did in Comora. The first fractures were enough. Below, Curze descended into the prison vaults. He went with chosen veterans only, the best of his killers, men who knew how to move without speaking, and how to ignore any sound that was not an order or a threat. The vaults beneath the Port of Knives ran deeper than Hive under cities, levels upon levels of pens, storage crypts, transport galleries and data shrines, recording the ownership, valuation, and movement of lives. The air there was wet and metallic. Doors were grown from black chitinous matter that shivered when cut. Rows of cells climbed into the heights like ossuary shelves, each holding shrunken figures in chains or nutrient harnesses. Some captives lunged toward the bars when the Night Lords passed, babbling prayers in a dozen human tongues. Others recoiled from the midnight armor and skull helms, uncertain whether new torment or salvation had come down among them. In one vault, a mass of Imperial captives saw Curze clearly and began to cry out. "Angels!" one of them wept, collapsing to his knees. "Throne, angels, we are saved." The word moved through the cells in ragged waves. Saved, rescue, deliverance. Curze looked at them without expression. He did not come to unmake their chains out of mercy. He came for ledgers, portal sigils, transit keys, proof of traffic, leverage over routes and lords. He came to seize the mechanisms by which the Dominion fed itself. Still, he understood the value of those thousands of desperate bodies better than they ever could. "Open this tier," he said. Ajalan hesitated only a fraction. "All of it?" "All." The doors split. At first the captives could not believe the release. Then they surged. Men, starved to shadows, laborers scarred by surgery, soldiers, voidsmen, children hardened into little more than bone and hate, all stumbling through the thresholds in a flood of disbelief. Some tried to cling to the Night Lords in gratitude. They were thrown aside. Some begged for weapons. A few were given them. Most were driven onward with the flat of chain blades or the crack of bolt pistols fired over their heads. "Upward," Curze ordered. "Drive them into the light." More gates opened. Beast pens, holding pits, transit locks, chained monsters from a dozen worlds came snarling into the corridors. Pain engines, improperly secured during the wider alarms, were cut loose and turned against their keepers. One whole cell block of altered gladiators broke into a surgical ward and fed their masters their own instruments. Every unlocked route was chosen to force movement toward the wealth tiers. Not hope, not escape, pressure. Bodies in numbers sufficient to overwhelm doors, clog lanes, crush guards, drown lifts, and turn the lower districts into one ascending avalanche of panic. The city began to devour itself. Arena underways lost power while bouts were in progress. Anti-grav carriages failed above knife-thin bridges and dropped patrons screaming into the slave crowds below. Pain engines rampaged through market squares where merchants had already drawn blades on one another over suspected treachery. Noble estates sealed their gates only to discover that those gates trapped them with their own mercenaries, who promptly renegotiated loyalties at gunpoint. Columns of released humans, maddened by terror and the sudden sight of open corridors, stampeded upward through the service tiers, trampling Drukhari attendants, crashing through banquet halls, swarming over pleasure balconies, and blooding the polished levels with sheer desperate mass. Over everything rolled the Night Lord's terror broadcasts, human screams amplified and thrown through local vox systems until no one could tell which cries came from genuine suffering and which were being looped for effect. In the harbour district, flayed bodies appeared on tower bridges so swiftly that rumour insisted they had always been there. In the arena wards, patron boxes were breached by former chattel-wielding tools, bones, chain lengths, and stolen splinter pistols. In the manufactoria, power cuts caused half-finished pain engines to wake shrieking on the assembly lines and murder the surgeons standing over them. Every effort to restore order deepened disorder, because every responding force was suspected of serving some hidden rival. Zelianth moved through his command galleries with a blade in one hand and the taste of failure rising like acid under his tongue. Reports contradicted one another faster than he could verify them. Vairosh accused Serin. Serin accused Malik. Mercenaries had taken side contracts. The prison vaults were open. The western anti-grav lanes were blind. The arena district was in riot. Incubi detachments had gone silent after entering noble compounds later found turned into public punishment displays in the old human style. Not random murder, instructional murder. That was when he understood. Not fully, not yet, but enough. He stood before a crystal port overlooking the dark harbour, where fires now bloomed in 3 separate tiers, and slave masses moved like living infection through the lower roads. Beside him, Urvek's ruined face had lost some portion of its amusement. This was no brute incursion, the homunculus said softly. Below them, on a bridge hung with fresh corpses and warning lights, a figure in midnight plate stood among his sons and looked upward through the smoke. Even at that distance, Zelianth knew him. The posture, the pallor, the stillness of something born for judgment rather than pleasure. He had wanted to provoke a terror king, to humiliate a Mon Ki specialist in fear, to steal from under his talons and make it spectacle. Instead, he had brought another sovereign into Komarar's shadow, and that sovereign was teaching the city itself how to scream. The Port of Knives burned in layers. From the lower slave roads to the upper pleasure spires, the Dominion had become a wound, lit from within. Anti-grav lanes failed and sent whole streams of gilded traffic plunging in sheets of fire through the market tiers below. Tower bridges snapped under the weight of stampeding bodies and dropped nobles, chattel, enforcers, and carrion birds alike into the dark gulf between districts. Arena vox systems screamed with stolen human agony. The skies above the harbour seethed with skimmers, strike craft and wreckage, all of it turning slow beneath chained lights and storm glare, while the city's own towers fired into one another through smoke and panic. Across one corpse bridge stretched between 2 noble galleries, Konrad Curze hunted. The bridge had once been decorative, its span woven from lacquered bones and the preserved bodies of old victims bent into arches of shrieking ornament. Now fresh dead lay over the ancient dead in a steaming mass. Blood sheeted down through the bones and fell in thin black streams into the abyss below. Curze crossed it in long, silent strides, claws wet, his pale face striped with arterial spray, not his own. Behind him came a knot of chosen veterans, their midnight plates shredded by splinter impacts, their trophies clotted with the gore of the dark kin. Ahead, retreating Cabalites fired over their shoulders, while slaves and lesser retainers shoved one another from the path to escape the thing gaining on them from behind. A Reaver jet bike screamed out of a side lane and skimmed low over the bridge, blade vanes aimed to reap heads from shoulders. Curze moved before its engine note had fully bitten the air. He dropped flat, one claw raking upward as the jet bike passed overhead. The talons sheared through the rider's abdomen and into the grav chassis. The machine, split in a burst of black blood and shrieking metal, cartwheeling end over end through a procession of fleeing Sybarites. Limbs spun away. One head struck a bridge stanchion so hard its face burst open like fruit under a hammer. The broken bike slammed into the far railing and detonated in a wash of green-white fire that set the antique corpses beneath the bridge alight. Curze did not slow. He ran through the fire. He cut down the first Cabalite as though taking a curtain aside, opened the second from throat to sternum, then seized the third by the spine and drove him face first into the bone lattice beneath his boots until vertebrae punched through lacquer and marrow. A fourth tried to turn and plead something elegant in the dark tongue of Comora. Curze split his jaw away and left him gargling on the bridge while his veterans passed over him into the next kill. The city tore itself apart around them. To the west, Ajalan's companies fought running battles up the anti-grav. Service ways against Cabalite gun lines drawn 3 ranks deep behind sculpted barricades of cured flesh and crystal. Bolter rounds blew dark kin apart in sprays of rib fragments and burning armor. Splinter storms answered, hissing through the smoke to stitch purple-black poison wounds across ceramite and flesh alike. Reaver packs scythed down the traffic lanes in screaming crescents, cutting auxiliary support crews and freed human mobs to ribbons. Night Lord's heavy weapons teams dragged autocannon carriages into firing alcoves and stitched the lanes with tracer fire until skimmers became tumbling torches and riders fell from the air like gutted birds. Below the Western District, slave populations stampeded by the million through blind service corridors and market stairs, driven upward by terror, by hunger, by the certainty that whatever followed behind was worse than whatever waited ahead. Some carried stolen blades, some carried their own chains and swung them until faces broke. Some did not even know whom they fought anymore. They trampled Drukhari attendants into paste. They were cut down by mercenaries, only for more to clamber over the dead and keep climbing. The whole undercity moved like a blood clot, forcing itself through a narrowing vein. None of it occupied Curze for long. He had fixed on the line of withdrawal that led toward the upper arena vaults, and everything in him had narrowed to that destination. He crossed balconies slick with spilt narcotics and opened pleasure chambers with one kick. He moved through torture galleries where chained captives still writhed in iron displays, and with every chamber he passed the understanding sharpened. Zelianth was retreating not toward safety, but toward spectacle, toward an audience, toward a place where fear could be repackaged into theater and control seized back through ceremony and blood. That much was obvious. The next part came in a blade flash behind the eyes. Curze stopped in the middle of a hanging gallery lined with screaming masks and saw 3 futures unfold at once. In one, he drove straight for the upper transit vaults. Fastest path, cleanest path. Daevkar and the surviving incubi stalled him there just long enough for Zelianth to escape through a sealed webway aperture beneath the arena floor, leaving his city to burn while he carried the tale of survival into Komarah proper. In another, Curze took the lower route through the flesh foundries. Hidden void shutters slammed and sealed him with a cohort of his sons inside black stone and null fields. He saw them dying around him by inches, poisoned, blinded, butchered by stitched horrors spilling from the walls. In the third, he split his strength and sent companies into the upper flanks to collapse the retreat corridors, while he went alone through the center. He saw legionaries dying by the score to hold those outer ways. He saw Malkarian lose half his company on a tower bridge that snapped under darklight. Fire. He saw Ajalan buried beneath a falling grav rail and claw his way out through a mound of bodies. He saw the cost clearly. He also saw Zelianth trapped. The vision broke. Sound returned. Blood dripped from Curze's nose. Malkarian saw it and understood enough to hate what came next. "Which road, Lord?" Curze pointed without hesitation. "You take the upper flanks, burn every transit lock, collapse every private bridge. No one leaves the arena quarter." Malkarian's scarred face hardened. "That will kill hundreds of our own in the side districts." "Yes." Ajalan stared at him through the crimson glare of his helm lenses. "Are we here to win, Lord, or to prove a point?" Curze turned and looked at him, fire reflected in his black eyes. Around them, the city screamed and collapsed and fed on itself. There is no difference. No son of his argued after that. They dispersed at a run, not because they agreed, but because disobedience in that moment would have been a smaller death than failure. Curze went forward with only his chosen veterans and the certainty of catastrophe at his back. The first incubi met him in the Hall of Scoured Breath, a long chamber of black pillars and hanging chains, where the walls had been carved into reliefs of old massacres. Daevkar stood at their head, helmed, silent, clave held in both hands, while 9 shrine brothers spread in a crescent around him. They advanced with perfect spacing, each step measured, each angle chosen to constrict the Primarch's movement and feed him into a kill mesh of overlapping arcs. To mortal sight, they would have seemed impossibly fast. To Curze, they were merely disciplined. The first incubus struck low, a testing cut aimed at the knee joint. Curze stepped inside it before the blade completed half its path and drove his claw through the warrior's throat, out the back of the helm and into the pillar behind. He left the corpse hanging there and twisted aside, as 2 more claves crossed where his ribs had been. The return slash took one attacker's forearms off at the elbow. Before the severed hands hit the floor, Curze had kicked the second incubus in the sternum hard enough to fold his torso inward and launch him backwards through a chain screen. Then they were all on him. Claves rose and fell in perfect shrine patterns. Black armor flashed. Bladed boots hissed over blood-slick stone. Curze moved through them like a nightmare given dimensions. He read intention in the pressure of hips, the set of shoulders, the breath before commitment. A half heartbeat before each strike fully began. He was no longer where the blade expected him to be. He ducked one overhead cut, caught the descending haft under his arm and snapped it, then rammed the splintered end through its wielder's face. He let another clave scrape sparks from his shoulder just to draw its owner too close, then raked 4 talons across the incubus's torso and opened him into hanging ribbons of wet black organs. One shrine warrior leapt from a side pillar, and Curze seized him mid-air by the leg, smashed him into a second incubus, then used the broken body as a shield against the next 2 cuts, before hurling both corpses into the survivors. Daevkar reached him last, as a Clivex should. The Shrine Master struck with frightening precision, each cut economical, no flourish wasted, his great blade slicing in diagonals that would have taken limbs and head in the same breath if they had landed. Curze met him blow for 3 savage seconds that sounded like metal gods trying to eat one another. Daevkar was magnificent. He was also dead before the duel began. Curze saw the moment of failure in the first exchange, hidden in the Shrine Master's instinctive correction after a missed throat cut. On the next pass, The Primarch baited the same adjustment, let Diavkar commit to the opening, then slipped beneath the returning edge and drove both, claws up through the incubus's abdomen. He lifted the Clivex from the floor, impaled and writhing, and turned him toward his dying shrine brothers. "Contract fulfilled," Curze said, and tore him in half. He left the pieces hanging from opposite chain runs and moved on. Urvek had prepared the next chambers personally. The approach to the arena vaults narrowed through a series of venom galleries, each wall veined with translucent conduits pulsing alchemical light. Floor grills exhaled narcotic mists that would have reduced mortals to screaming delirium in breaths. Needle nests flowered from the arches. Sculptures that had seemed decorative unfurled into stitched horrors as Curze entered, their bodies assembled from several species at once and kept animate through screaming grafts of nerve wire and pumping sacs. One thing came at him on 12 limbs, its central torso a cluster of still-living human upper bodies sewn together around a rotary maw. Another dragged itself forward, on split pelvises and injector tails, fighting on even after its head was ripped away because there were 3 more mouths distributed down its spine. The architecture itself joined the assault. Walls opened into tooth-lined vents that spat acid leeches and clouds of razor chaff. Ceiling runnels dumped boiling venom in glittering curtains across the path. Urvek watched from a suspended surgery dais above, robes stirring in the poison vapor, his many tools glinting like a mobile shrine to malpractice. "Observe, Mon-Ki King," he called in a voice full of delighted contempt. "Your lesson enters refinement." Curze answered by taking the stitched thing nearest him apart with such speed that for a moment it seemed to burst spontaneously. Limbs flew, sacs ruptured, human faces sewn into its chest screamed independently, even after the body had been reduced to gobbets and tendon strings. He tore through the next horror, and the next, not merely killing them, but dismantling them into recognizable components. He ripped one creature's central spine out with both hands and used it as a flail to smash apart the syringe racks on the wall. He tore open a venom conduit and kicked the spilling stream into a pursuing abomination until it melted from the legs upward, still clawing. When a dismembered graft beast kept trying to crawl by, dragging itself with exposed nerve ropes, Curze nailed it to the floor with its own femur through what remained of its mouth. Urvek hissed laughter and deployed more. "Endless appetite," Curze said as he reached the central pillar. "No discipline, no law, only indulgence stretched until it calls itself culture." Urvek spread his needle hands. How sternly the butcher moralizes. Curze sprang. He hit the surgery dais hard enough to overturn it. Urvek skittered backward on hidden limbs, scalpels and injector tendrils flashing, slashing chemical arcs through the air. Curze let 2 cuts score his vambrace, then caught the homunculus by one articulated arm and tore it free in a spray of dark fluids and twitching graft cables. Urvek shrieked, not entirely in pain. Curze tore away another limb, then another, and each piece he ripped loose, he impaled upon the gallery rails or the wall behind, arranging them in a widening spread. A hand there, a grinning half-face there, a cluster of tools and dangling organs higher up. Message board gore. Anatomical blasphemy reassembled into warning. Urvek writhed in what remained of himself, still trying to crawl, still trying to bite, still trying to inject toxins through a hidden spine tube. Curze split him stem to sternum and spread the halves against the surgery arch like a flayed devotional icon. "Pain should instruct," Curze said to the dying thing. "You make it a feast." He left the remains displayed over the gallery mouth, every surviving eye turned toward the route of retreat. By then, the arena quarter was becoming a war entire unto itself. Night. Lords and Cabalite companies fought along parallel tower faces, connected by bridges no wider than a coffin lid. Grav traffic burned in suspended knots above plazas, drowned in stampeding slave masses. Arena cult enforcers in barbed war gear poured from side gates to defend their patrons, and were met by Astartes descending on jump packs through lightning-lit smoke. One tower toppled after melter charges cut its anti-grav spine. It fell slow at first, then with gathering violence, crushing 2 lower districts beneath it in a storm of shattered crystal, flesh, and black stone. Elsewhere, Malkarian's men held 3 collapsing private bridges against repeated Reaver charges and Darklight fire, because the Primarch had seen that those bridges must hold for 7 more minutes. They held them. Few lived through the 7th. Curze felt each death as pressure behind his eyes. Another spike of foresight hit him at the threshold to the upper galleries. He saw a dozen versions of the coming confrontation. In one, Ajalan reached him in time to form a cordon and died to Darklight lances that should have taken Curze instead. In another, the arena floor split and released a beast pit before the crowd was seated, ruining the spectacle Zelianth was trying to assemble. In another, the Archon stood atop the central dais and laughed while a hidden gate yawned open behind him. Each path had to be culled. Each choice cost blood. Each correction killed sons who would never know why they had been sent where they were sent. Curze chose without hesitation. Such was the tragedy of serving him. He could see the coin before it was spent, and spent it anyway. At last, he reached the final ascent, a corpse bridge leading into the grand amphitheater at the heart of the slave port. There the walls were lined with fresh flayed banners stirring in furnace wind. The bridge itself had been dressed for spectacle. Every 10th corpse posed upright to create a colonnade of opened bodies between which the chosen combatants would pass. Fires burned in braziers made from fused skulls. The city's screams rolled up from below like surf. Zelianth had understood at least this much. If fear was to be contested, it would be contested before witnesses. Curze crossed the bridge alone for the last stretch. The gate iris to the amphitheater yawned wide before him, and beyond it opened a vast arena, ringed by ascending galleries in the style of a crucible mockery. All black stone, hooked balconies and tiers crowded with surviving elites, hired blades, wounded nobles, and those retainers too desperate or too arrogant to flee. Beast cages lined the lower perimeter. Captives knelt in chained rows beneath the viewing tiers. Incubi stood guard at the central approaches. Above, lightning crawled across a caged storm vault, casting the whole theater in pulses of corpse white and abyssal black. Zelianth Vor waited at the center amid his remaining splendor, surrounded by surviving lieutenants, bound killers, and nightmare beasts straining at their chains. Curze stepped into the arena, and the final spectacle began. The grand arena of the slave port had been built to teach hierarchy through spectacle. Its floor was a basin of black stone, polished by centuries of blood. Hooked galleries climbed above it in layer upon layer of wealth and appetite, each tier hung with flayed banners, chained lights and cages containing beasts too valuable or too entertaining to be loosed before the appointed hour. Tens of thousands had crammed themselves into those galleries, despite the city breaking apart around them, because Komarar's kind had always trusted cruelty to restore order. Where mortals fled disaster, the dark kin gathered to watch it. Their rank fed upon audience as much as pain. They needed witnesses. They needed the lower castes to look up. They needed the lesser cabals to see which masters still possessed the right to command. And beyond the arena walls, beyond the hooked balconies and the central killing floor, millions more received the spectacle by pain circuit mirrors suspended across the Dominion. In noble towers and market plazas, in torture chapels and docking halls, in the reeking vaults where captives waited in chains, crystal screens shivered with stolen image and sound. The whole outer realm watched. Rival cabals watched. Mercenaries watched. Flesh artisans and slavers and pit lords watched. The invasion had ceased to be a battle and become a political referendum written in blood. Zelianth Vor stood at the center dais as though he still possessed the right to define the moment. He had discarded the languor of his court for armor and ceremony. His war gear gleamed dark jade and shadow black beneath the stormlight caged over the amphitheater. Soul traps hung from his cuirass like predatory fruit. A field of distortion shimmered around him in faint ripples, warping the air where his lean silhouette met the killing floor. In one hand, he held a curved blade so thin it seemed made from the edge of absence itself. In the other, he carried a hooked pistol, whose muzzle wept venom in bright, slow tears. Around him stood the remnants of his prestige, surviving Sybarites in lacquered mail, hired incubi with unreadable helms, beastmasters in barbed harness, Kabbalite elites with splinter rifles held at ceremonial ready, chained monsters strained in their pits along the arena's lower rim, snapping at the ironwork. Captives knelt in rows beneath the galleries, hands manacled behind them, heads forced down for the audience's pleasure. When Curze stepped onto the black floor, Zelianth smiled as if the night itself had come merely to furnish his stage. "Behold," the Archon called, and his voice carried through amplifiers hidden in the stone. "The Mon K Terror King, the Butcher of Hives, the alley sovereign of a dying species. He has come into our shadow to die for our delight." Laughter spilled from the galleries, elegant, venomous, almost lazy. Some of it was real, some of it was fear sharpening itself into performance. Zelianth gave them no time to distinguish the difference. He imagined himself singular, the Archon continued, a creature of punishment, of screams, of theatre. Yet what is he here? Another crude warlord in stolen darkness. Another slab of animal will come to feed the city that taught pain its proper grammar. Watch closely, all of you. Watch the lesson. Let every Kabbalite court, every mercenary compact, every flesh market and sky dock remember what becomes of those who mistake appetite for sovereignty. Curze did not answer. He walked forward 3 measured paces and stopped. His face was a pale ruin beneath the storm cage, striped by drying blood. The black eyes fixed on Zelianth held no rage, only the terrible clarity of a sentence already decided. That silence unsteadied the Archon more than any taunt might have done. It lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the lights died. Not dimmed, died. The chained luminaires above the galleries went black in one cascading wave, tier after tier, until the amphitheater became a bowl of sudden night, cut only by the storm flickering overhead. At the same instant, the pain circuit mirrors across the Dominion shrieked as their theft engines overloaded. Vox thieves hidden inside the arena's transmission ducts screamed into feedback. The sound that burst through the darkness was not music, not alarm, but a layered chorus of flayed human death cries amplified to impossible volume by legion voxcasters buried in the arena's service walls. Men howling as skin came away in strips, choked pleas, wet gasps, the final drowning panic of open throats. The noises rolled through the amphitheater and through every functioning screen in the Dominion, not as random horror, but as composition, timed and repeated and sharpened until even Comorite nerves recoiled. Then the beast pits ruptured. Charges. Curze's kill teams had planted hours earlier went off beneath the lower locks. Iron grates blew inward. Chains snapped. The first creatures came out in sprays of steam and blood. Razor maws, stitched gladiator horrors, scaled things from dead suns, pale serpents swollen on old narcotics, and one massive arena beast whose flanks were plated in hooked bronze and human jawbones. They burst into the lower stands and among the handlers at once. Beastmasters had just enough time to realize their control rigs were dead before their own stock dragged them apart. From the dark above the galleries, Night Lords descended. Assault squads dropped on grav lines and jump packs through the blind tiers like executioners hurled from the void. Bolters thundered. The wealthy viewing galleries became slaughter galleries in breaths. Sybarites were blown open in their lacquered seats, their jewels and ribs spraying over their neighbors. Cabal patrons who had come to judge the duel died on their feet, with explosive rounds bursting through throat and sternum. Incubi bodyguards tried to form shields around their employers and were met by chain blades roaring in the dark. Every upper tier became close, intimate murder lit by storm flashes and the intermittent glare of burning bodies. The crowd's reaction mattered more than the first deaths. For the first time in their long, diseased existence, many of those watching felt terror, not as curated entertainment, not as nutriment consumed at a safe remove, but as direct species-level recoil. They had built their society on asymmetry, on being the knife, the hook, the amphitheater owner, the masked observer above the screaming floor. Now the floor was climbing. The dark was moving among them with military intent. The death cries filling the air were not there to amuse, but to teach. In those first blind seconds, whole galleries discovered that fear returned to its sender with a force they had never bothered to imagine. Panic spread with exquisite speed. Some nobles drew blades on their own bodyguards, convinced betrayal had finally come. Some shoved toward private exits and found them sealed. Others froze, unable to process that the night itself had entered the arena and taken the audience first. Along the lower tiers, human and Xenos slaves surged upward in great filthy tides as opened service gates and broken pen locks delivered them into the stands. They came screaming, starving, mad with terror and sudden momentum. They trampled handlers beneath bare feet and chain-shod boots. They clawed down those who had owned them minutes before. Some simply fled upward, crushing anyone in their path. Others turned on the nearest Drukhari with such accumulated hatred that the kills became frenzy. Gladiator crews died in knots beneath their own former chattel. Across the whole Dominion, the same contagion bloomed. Pre-planted charges burst in transit substations. Seized portal cores overloaded. Districts shuddered as anti-grav balances failed. Docking chains snapped and sent slave barges swinging into tower faces. Gravity faltered in sections of the harbor, and men, Xenos and cargo alike, floated for one ghastly breath before new vectors seized them and smashed them sideways into walls. Slave vaults vented into dead dark. Noble bridges detached. The outer realm began to come apart under its own systems, with the grotesque elegance of a carcass opening seam by seam. At the center of it all, Xelianth moved first. He fired as the dark took the arena. Venom rounds hissed toward Curze in a tight triad aimed at eye, throat, and groin. Curze turned through them, one grazing the side of his gorget in a spray of sizzling toxin, and crossed half the distance between them before the Archon's second breath. Xelianth met him in a ripple of shadow field distortion, blade whipping in from below. The edge bit into the seam beneath Curze's ribs and skated through ceramite, drawing a black line of blood. Curze answered with both claws in a descending rake that carved through the Archon's field shimmer and tore 3 deep furrows across his breastplate. The duel was vicious from the first contact. There was nothing elegant in it. Xelianth fought like a creature bred in a civilization where treachery and grace had merged generations ago. He was fast enough that mortal sight would have mistaken his movements for broken light. He cut low, high, reversed, twisted sideways, used the distortion field to blur his true position, and struck from angles no human swordsman could have conceived. His hooked pistol barked point blank when range collapsed, venom rounds punching into Curze's side and shoulder where ceramite had already been opened. His blade found seams. Once it slid under Curze's left vambrace and buried itself to the hilt in the meat of the forearm. Curze hit harder. He fought not as a duelist, but as judgment-given muscle. One claw strike clipped Xelianth's shoulder and almost tore the arm away outright. A backhand smashed the Archon off his feet and hurled him through a row of ceremonial standards so hard that his ribs cracked loud enough to be heard over the arena's chaos. Xelianth rolled up in a blur, teeth bared, blood black on his lips, and drove his blade into Curze's thigh. Curze caught him by the wrist, and head butted him full in the face. Cartilage burst. Several of the Archon's teeth sprayed across the black stone. They crashed together in a knot of armor, talons, knife work, and raw animal violence, slamming against the central dais, breaking apart, coming together again with enough force to crater the floor beneath them. Zelianth slashed Curze's cheek open. Curze answered by burying his claws in the Archon's abdomen and dragging him across the stone until loops of dark intestine tried to follow. The shadow field spat and shrieked. The Archon stabbed upward repeatedly, one poisoned blade finding the gap beneath Curze's shoulder, another carving across his collar. Curze bit through the side of Zelianth's jaw when the Archon tried to slip free. Blood, teeth, and fragments of lacquered armor stuck between his teeth as he tore away. Around them, the spectacle worsened. Night Lords gunned down the last organized resistance in the galleries. Assault squads swung down onto trophy vaults and hacked open reliquaries full of preserved skins and captive curiosities, spilling their contents into the stampeding masses below. Beast handlers died under the maws of their own stable stock. Incubi fell fighting with professional silence as slave mobs surged over their corpses. Every storm flash showed a different arrangement of massacre. Zelianth realized it before anyone said it. The duel no longer controlled the narrative. It was being consumed by it. He sprang back, chest heaving, shadow field flickering raggedly around him. Half his face was red-black ruin from the jaw wound. One eye had begun to swell shut. Yet even then, the Archon still possessed enough pride to sneer through blood. "You cannot hold this place," he said. "Even if you kill me, you are only in the outer dark. I can give you paths, names, rival cabals, hidden ways through the veins of the city, deeper ports, better prey. Take the bargain, Monkey. Learn how far beneath the skin you have truly cut." Curze stalked toward him through the bloodwash at the center of the arena. "You think knowledge is the prize?" "It is," Zelianth hissed. "There are gates you could never find, thrones you could never reach, Archons who would flay worlds to buy your silence. Comarach is larger than your species' fear." Curze stopped close enough that the Archon had to tilt his ruined face upward to meet his eyes. "I know," he said. That answer, more than the refusal itself, stripped something from Zelianth. The Archon understood then that Curze had never come as a conqueror in search of dominion, loot, or secret passage. This was not hunger, it was demonstration, example over advantage, sentence over opportunity. Zelianth lunged in desperation, blade aimed for the throat. Curze caught the wrist, broke it, and drove his other fist into the Archon's sternum, hard enough to burst armor plates and punch broken ribs into lung and heart. Zelianth sagged, choking, yet Curze did not let him fall. He dragged him by the throat and hair to the front edge of the central dais, where the arena could see him clearly and where the surviving pain circuit mirrors could drink every detail. What followed was not execution. It was nostrum and punishment. Curze pinned the Archon spread wide against one of the arena's black standard poles with hooked chains and his own claws. He opened the armor first, tearing it away in strips and exposing the long, pale torso beneath. He flensed with patient violence, each cut deliberate, each layer taken so that the face remained untouched. Zelianth screamed then, not with stylized disdain, not with the curated performance of the Drukhari aristocracy, but with the raw, involuntary animal sound of a creature meeting agony it cannot aestheticize. Curze left the features whole, eyes, mouth, enough cheek and brow for every watcher to recognize who was hanging there. Recognition was the point. Humiliation was the point. The audience had to see their better reduced to meat, while his identity remained intact. The arena watched. The Dominion watched. Some looked away and then looked back because they could not help themselves. Some trembled openly. Some began running before the punishment finished, which only worsened the crush in the galleries and sent more bodies toppling into the lower pits. All through it, Curze worked in public silence, broken only by Zelianth's failing screams and the wider thunder of a city dismantling itself. At last, he stepped back. The Archon still lived for a handful of breaths, hanging skinless from the standard face, intact, and eyes wide with the final comprehension that his death had become language. Then even that went out of him. Across the Dominion, the planted charges reached their final sequence. Portal cores ruptured in chain reaction. Whole districts detached from their moorings and sagged into the abyss. Gravity failed in sweeping waves. Flesh markets folded into lower avenues. Arena towers split. Docking spines tore free. In the prison depths, venting chambers swallowed the dead and living together into black air. The slave port, so long convinced of its own inviolable cruelty, began to tear itself to pieces under the weight of sabotaged systems, panic, and reciprocal treachery. Curze looked up into the storm cage and gave the last order. Legion Voxcasters seized every functioning channel left in the outer realm. The pain circuit mirrors shuddered, stabilized, and filled once more with image and sound. They showed Zelianth Vor hanging ruined above his own arena. They showed the galleries burning. They showed the rich fleeing beneath slave mobs and falling towers. And through every speaker, relay, public whale box, and stolen crystal feed, the message rolled in Curze's low, corpse-cold voice. Even the tormentors can scream. By the time Zelianth Vor's ruined corpse stopped twitching above the arena dais, the Port of Knives had already begun to die in earnest. Its death was not clean. It did not deserve cleanliness. The outer dominion tore itself apart in shrieking layers. Whole districts peeled from their moorings and sagged into the abyss beneath the harbor. Anti-grav veins failed in stuttering chains, sending slave barges, market skiffs, and pleasure litters smashing through lower tiers in showers of crystal, bone, and screaming flesh. Docking towers leaned into one another like execution poles in a gale, their chained spans snapping loose and whipping through the dark. Portal cores overloaded deep under the black streets and bled cold light up through cracks in the stone, so that whole plazas glowed from beneath with the pallor of opened graves before collapsing inward. Arena fires spread along banner lines and gallery rails until the amphitheater itself seemed to wear a crown of moving flame. Victory existed in that ruin. Real victory. Not illusion, not mere boast. The 8th Legion had not come into Comora's shadow and vanished like prey. They had bloodied one of its monstrous outer dominions. They had slain an Archon before his own kind. They had broken a slave port whose people had believed themselves beyond reprisal. They had forced the Dark Kin to feel terror, not as indulgence, but as visitation. That truth would live after the bodies cooled. It was also poisoned beyond redemption. On the upper tiers of the arena, Ajalan gathered the remains of his command cadre beneath a half-collapsed viewing arch, while Night Lord's kill teams moved among the dead and dying, finishing resistance and marking routes back, toward the breach. His armor had been split at the flank and shoulder. Poison burn had blackened the edges of the wound seals. One horned trophy chain hung snapped from his gorget, where a reaver blade had bitten too close. He looked down over the arena floor, over the slave tides still boiling through the lower gates, over the fires and ruptured pits, and the skinless body of Zelianth hanging for all to see, and knew that triumph had become too expensive to celebrate. Reports came to him in fragments. Malkarian lived, though less of his company did. The upper flank bridges had held long enough to choke the retreat corridors, then failed in sequence exactly as feared. 100 legionaries had gone down into the gulf with the collapsing spans. Perhaps a few had survived on lower ledges. No one had the time to find out. The assault wings that had descended on the harbor's anti-grav substations were shattered. One entire strike group had been sealed inside a collapsing transit. Throat, when the webway geometry convulsed under sabotage strain. Their vox signals continued for several minutes after the stone closed over them, then became grinding static and wet sounds that no one cared to interpret aloud. Thousands of Legion serfs and mortal auxiliaries were already dead. More would never reach the extraction routes. Whole army cohorts that had survived the first entry into the Black Vein had been left in the lower arteries to hold fallback lines while the Legion struck the arena quarter. Many of them had held exactly as ordered. Most would now die where they stood, either butchered by converging Drukhari counterattacks or swallowed by collapsing paths. Their commanders sent pleas for relief through command channels already drowned by higher priority traffic. The pleas went unanswered. Even the captives who had been loosed as living contagion paid their own butcher's bill. Countless thousands had been cut down in crossfire between Night Lords and Kabbalite gun lines. Others had suffocated when venting vaults emptied into dead air. Some had escaped only to die of starvation in sealed service districts, or to lose what remained of their minds amid the impossible cold and wrongness of the webway routes, now shivering toward collapse. Rescue had never been part of the arithmetic. Freedom, where granted, had been another weapon, and weapons were spent. Ajalan listened to it all without outward reaction. That was the only dignity left to command. Malkarian reached him last, limping hard, helm under one arm, chain-blade teeth clogged with black ichor and old human tissue. His face looked carved from the aftermath of a shipwreck. He glanced once at Zelianth's hanging body, then at the collapsing tiers beyond. "We have made the point," he said, "and the city is waking." Ajalan followed his gaze. Beyond the immediate ruin of the slave port, deeper lights had begun to move in the dark. Not random traffic, not panicked local response. Far off among the greater reaches of the hidden city, whole districts were changing posture. Tower constellations that had remained aloof now brightened with ordered signal runs. Needle-thin vessels detached from impossible heights and began to circle inward. Gate signatures flared in patterns the Mechanicum adepts could not pass. The dominion they had broken had been noticed, not by one named ruler issuing a singular decree. Komara was too diseased, too layered, too old for anything so simple. It was older powers turning their attention, rival predators scenting blood, lords of deeper ports, cold intelligences in veiled spires, authorities who had no need to declare themselves so long as lesser beings began moving in obedience to their curiosity. The dark city had opened one eye. Ajalan felt the weight of that gaze with a clarity he had not known even under the Emperor's own satellites. More officers converged beneath the broken arch. Some were wounded badly enough that their armor served more as coffin than protection. One argued for pressing deeper, while the enemy reeled, for taking plunder, data, and live specimens enough to ransom entire sectors. Another, younger and still half drunk on slaughter, wanted to drive on simply because retreat tasted too much like incompletion. Malkarian shut him up with a stare. Others had reached the opposite conclusion. They had seen too much. One more step, one more district, one more attempt to carry fear further into the black, and the Legion would vanish inside an infinity of knives. They were not facing a city that could be beheaded. They were standing at the edge of an abyss that could keep unfolding new mouths forever. "Withdrawal," Malkarian said flatly. "Now, before every path behind us closes." The younger officer snarled. "After this, after we have split them open, we should bleed them harder." "We already are bleeding," Malkarian said. The argument might have become violence under another sire. Curze ended it by arriving in silence. He came from the central dais, with Zelianth's blood drying black across his claws and breastplate, his pale face expressionless beneath the storm glare. The Night Lords around him instinctively made room. He seemed untouched by the scale of devastation he had caused, yet something in his eyes had retreated further inward, as though the victory itself had confirmed nothing worth cherishing. He halted beneath the broken arch and looked not at his sons, but past them, into distances no one else could see. The vision took him there. Ajalan recognized the moment, by the way the Primarch's breathing changed, and by the blood that slipped fresh from one nostril and traced the line of his lip. No one spoke. No one dared. Curze saw not triumph, but inevitability. He saw the slave port burning behind him, and knew it would matter only as scar tissue. He saw the dark kin remember this lesson, not reform from it. Fear had reached them. It had not healed them. Nothing healed in this galaxy. Nothing was corrected except for a span, a delay, a wound made instructive before rot resumed its work. Beyond the immediate fire, he saw his own sons dying in routes not yet taken if he lingered. He saw the breach harden against them. He saw black stone close over retreating companies until their gene-wrought hearts stopped in the dark. He saw darker powers looking on from the city's immeasurable depths and deciding that this insult deserved patient, exquisite answer. He saw, farther still, another darkness on another night. A chamber, waiting blades, the shape of his own death still ahead of him, unchanged by everything he had done here. He understood then what he had always understood and hated for it. Terrifying monsters changed nothing fundamental. The galaxy remained sick. Fear was never cure, only delay, only instrument, only the hand on the throat for one more minute before the body convulsed again. When the vision released him, he wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of one gauntlet. "We leave," he said. The younger officer drew breath to protest and thought better of it. Curze went on, as though ordering the disposal of scrap. "The Dominion burns. The gates collapse behind us. Every charge not yet fired will be fired. Every viable route to the breach is to be stripped clean by our passing. Any legionary too slow to reach extraction is already dead." No one asked about the mortal forces still fighting in the lower arteries. No one asked about the captives who had taken the words of salvation from the lips of monsters. Those questions had answers too ugly to require speech. Orders rippled outward through the command net. Withdrawal began. It became its own chapter of horror before the first company had cleared the arena quarter. The Night Lords fell back through a city that was dying faster than it could admit it. Rearguard squads held corpse bridges, while dark kin. Counterattacks crashed into them from 3 directions at once. One veteran claw defended a grav-line descent against a full Reaver pack until the traffic spine beneath them exploded and turned the whole shaft into a vortex of burning metal and tumbling bodies. In a market district already half detached from its moorings, Kabbalite elites poured splinter fire into boarding columns of retreating serfs and auxiliaries, cutting them down in strips, while the Astartes above them fought to keep the route open for 3 more minutes of impossible time. Malkarian lost his standard bearer and 24 veterans in a black stairwell where mandrakes boiled out of the walls and had to be hacked apart in the dark by sound and instinct alone. The path back into the webway was worse. The arteries through which the Legion had entered were collapsing under the compounded strain of sabotage, portal rupture, and Comorit interference. Corridors lengthened into impossible reaches, then folded short so suddenly that marching columns crashed into one another in confusion. Bridges that had existed on the advance were now missing, replaced by lightless drops full of drifting wreckage and dead men. Whole sections of the passage skin pulsed like wounded tissue and split open to reveal side channels crowded with waiting Drukhari marksmen. Darklight ripped through boarding formations with nauseating brilliance, punching fist-sized holes through Astartes plate and leaving the survivors to drag their wounded through frost and dimensional fire, while the walls themselves screamed with trapped echoes. At one kill point near the breach line, a full cohort of army auxilia held a causeway under Legion order, while the last of Ajalan's wounded crossed. They stood knee-deep in their own dead, laser guns gone to heat warp and then to clubbing weapons, firing until no power packs remained. Reaver blades took them in sheaves. Mandrakes opened them from behind. Still they held. When the Night Lords finally withdrew the last of the wounded past that point, the causeway detonated by remote charge and took the surviving auxilia with it. Their names were never recorded. Their utility had ended. Ajalan himself carried one wounded veteran for the final stretch after the warrior lost both legs to a collapsing edge of reality and still refused sedation. The wounded legionary laughed blood into his own helm and asked whether they had truly frightened the Xenos. Ajalan did not answer. He had no breath to spare on lies or reassurance. Behind them, the webway burned in a manner no mortal geography should have allowed. Portal ruptures spread like cracks in ice seen from beneath. Pale fire rolled along the corridor veins. Cold winds screamed through spaces that were not exposed to any sane vacuum. Chained captives, abandoned by both sides, stumbled through the carnage and vanished in flashes of impossible light or under the boots of retreating soldiery. One Mechanicum recovery train, carrying Soul-Tech relics and partial webway maps, was hit by a dark light volley and vanished into a widening slit of white-black brilliance. Every red-robed adept aboard it erased so thoroughly that even the Vox logged silence instead of death. At last, the Manufacturum breach on Vanikar came into view. It hung at the end of the collapsing black vein, like a wound remembering its first cut. Beyond it waited the scorched cathedral floor, the screaming induction pylons, the reek of real space, and the guns of the 8th Legion covering the extraction point. Night Lords poured through by companies, by shattered knots, by individuals limping and dragging and cursing through broken Vox units. Behind them came a flood of anything else that had managed to survive in proximity to the retreat. Serfs, wounded, a few half-mad captives who did not understand where they were going, a handful of auxilia blackened by poison and smoke. Some made it through, many did not. The final extraction deck, aboard Nightfall, became a place of counting losses in blood instead of numbers. Medici servitors moved among the survivors with circular saws and injector clamps. Gene seed retrieval teams cut open the dead where they lay. Armorers stripped salvage from the fallen before the blood had cooled. In one section of the hangar, a row of bodies lay covered in black tarpaulins, weighted down by detached helms. In another, the living sat against bulkheads, in silence too deep for grief to disturb. Malkarian approached Curze there, while the Primarch stood looking out through the armored deck aperture at Vanikar below. The world burned as it had burned before. The subsector beyond remained under the same blockade, the same silence, the same old lesson writ large in ash and orbital fire. Was it justice? Malkarian asked. It was not a challenge. It was weariness, finally given words. Curze did not turn from the viewport. The light from the planet's fires painted the edges of his armor in dull red. Alien blood and human blood alike had dried across him in indistinguishable stains. No, he said. It was understanding. Malkarian said nothing after that, because there was nothing to say. Back in real space, nothing had been saved in any noble sense. The slave port had been broken, yes. The Dark Kin had been answered, yes. But the subsector remained a charnel empire of its own. Billions across the worlds under sanction were still dead, disappeared, broken, impressed into labor, butchered in raids, or left to endure the kind of peace the 8th Legion knew how to enforce. Hives still burned, trench lines still filled with nameless corpses. Merchant dynasties had been wiped out. Auxilia regiments had been expended to the last man. Entire populations would never know whether the screams in the night had come from alien raiders or the Emperor's own terror troops. The Night Lords had not rescued the worlds beneath their guns. They had avenged an insult and written a lesson where monsters would feel it. Later, when the fleet had resumed its deathly station and the wounded were being sorted from the nearly dead, Curze went alone into darkness. Not to a throne room, not to a strategium, to an unlit chamber deep within nightfall where no voice intruded unless he permitted it. There he stood in the black, with his armor still fouled by the campaign, black with Xeno's blood in one place, dark red with human blood in another, and let the silence press against him like burial earth. He closed his eyes and saw again the arena, the hanging Archon, the burning port, the deeper lights of the dark city turning toward him with cold curiosity. Then that vision thinned, as all immediate things did, and another shape waited beyond it. His own death. Distant, but not distant enough. A room, a blade, the certainty that all roads, even victorious ones, still bent toward the same final knife. He had made monsters fear him. He had walked into their shadow and left it scarred, and still he was only walking toward the murder already waiting in the dark.